Welcome to the Mountain Meadows Massacre cover-up video. Okay, a quote here by Steven Weinberg, pictured above. With or without religion, good people can behave well, and bad people can do evil. But for good people to do evil, that takes religion. And Surgeon Brewer had the following to say about Mountain Meadows Massacre. He said it was the most brutal butchery ever perpetrated on this continent. And throughout this video, I'm going to abbreviate Mountain Meadows Massacre as MMM. Okay, church historian B.H. Roberts had the following to say about Mountain Meadows Massacre. He said it was the most lamentable episode in Utah history and in the history of the church. And church historian Juanita Brooks had the following to say about Mountain Meadows Massacre. She said it was one of the most despicable mass murders of history. So this is a big deal. It's a mass murder. Okay, a quote from Anne Eliza Young, one of the wives of Brigham Young. She says the Mountain Meadows Massacre was the foulest blot of Mormon history. And of course, Anne is pictured above. Okay, the Apostle John Taylor, who went on to become the third prophet of the Mormon Church, said the Mountain Meadows Massacre was sickening, a relentless, diabolical, bloody deed, outrageous, a horrible deed, and a defenseless tragedy. This in a series of letters that was published in the Deseret News newspaper in 1874. Apostle Joseph Fielding Smith had the following to say. He said, Mountain Meadows Massacre was the most horrible and shocking crime ever perpetrated within the borders of the state. Okay, a quote from William Wise. He wrote a book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre that we won't get too much into in this video, but I like this quote. He says, Mormons committed crimes so cruel and formidable that they would have to be concealed at whatever cost from the rest of the civilized world. And of course, Mountain Meadows Massacre was one of those cruel and formidable crimes that would have to be concealed. Okay, a quote here by a book put out by the church, What You Don't Know About the 100 Most Important Events in Church History, which came out a couple years ago. They said the Mountain Meadows Massacre still haunts the public image of the church today, or of the Latter-day Saints today, and raises a number of troubling questions. Yes, that is true. Okay, the Mormons Davis Byton, pictured above, and Maureen Ursenbach. They said Mountain Meadows Massacre was one of the darkest and most secret episodes in Mormon history. So that's getting more into the cover-up, which this video is about. It was a secret episode. All right, a little statement here by the Mormon teacher and book writer William E. Barrett in his book, The Restored Church, 1973. He said, the church must not be condemned because of the vile deeds of a few of its members. Only a few. So he's kind of doing some apologetics here. Really, there was like 50 to 60 Mormons that participated in Mountain Meadows Massacre. So I wouldn't say that is a few. And they are the ones that planned and organized it. So I think it does bring condemnation upon the church. Some of the leaders of the Mountain Meadows Massacre were stake presidents. One was a bishop. It probably went higher up through the ranks than that. But yeah, stake presidents killing people, I would say, yeah, you can blame that on the church. So the church has never officially apologized. They've never used the word apology. They've never said, we're sorry. The closest they got was a statement here by Apostle Henry B. Eyring in 2007. He says, and he's pictured above here, he says, we express profound regret for the massacre carried out in this valley 150 years ago today. we express profound regret. Regret is feeling sad. Okay, so maybe some of the leaders have felt sad. They felt repentant, and they're disappointed. That's more about the people who committed the crime. They regret it than really saying a sincere, honest apology of, I am sorry. I am sorry we killed people from your family, to the descendants. So, but that's as close as they've gotten, regret. And we know that the church does not like to use the word apology. The Apostle Dallin H. Oakes said the following in 2015, "The church does not seek apologies, and we don't give them." We don't give apologies, according to Dallin H. Oakes, one of the highest leaders in the church. Even if we kill 120 men, women, and children, we're still not going to apologize. But we will express some regret. Okay, a statement here from Kay Birmingham in her book is An American Fraud, One Lawyer's Case Against Mormonism, which came out in 2011. Very good book. Kay is pictured above here. She says, no reparations for the victims of Mountain Meadows Massacre or their descendants have ever been paid by the Mormon Church. No reparations have ever been paid to them. If they had a case and were to sue the church, how much could they get? Millions? Maybe even billions of dollars in reparations. And the church does not like it when people ask questions about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. If you were to bring this up in Sunday school and church, you'd probably get a lot of looks and stares of like, why are you bringing up that sad part of history in a Sunday school class? They don't like you to ask that question. And BYU professor Robert Millett even said such in a talk at BYU. He says the issue is not Adam God, so don't ask that question. The issue isn't about Mountain Meadows Massacre. Don't ask about that. The issue is not plural marriage. The issue facing the religious world today is, was Joseph Smith called of God? That's the question you should be asking. Was Joseph Smith called of God? All the other controversial stuff, you shouldn't even be asking questions about that. And of course, Millett is pictured above. All right, so one of the big issues with Mountain Meadows Massacre is a lot of people think it had a lot to do with blood atonement, that they were blood atoning this immigrant train coming through Utah. And we'll get more into that on a few other slides. But in the New York Herald, Brigham Young did an interview, and the correspondent asked him, do you believe in blood atonement? And Brigham Young says, yes, I do. And I believe that Lee has not half atoned for his great crime. We'll get more into that. John D. Lee was a scapegoat and blamed by the church pretty much for the whole Mountain Meadows Massacre, even though 50 to 60 other Mormon men participated in the crime. The church doesn't like to talk about blood atonement. Killing people that deserve to die, killing people that killed their prophets, Joseph and Hiram Smith, the people who killed Parley P. Pratt. But I think it has a lot to do with Mountain Meadows Massacre, and in non-Mormon books, they talk quite a bit about blood atonement being a factor. And I did a whole entire video on blood atonement, which you can go watch on my channel. Okay, and D. Michael Quinn talked about this in the Mormon Hierarchy Extensions of Power book. He said, pioneer Mormons took blood atonement sermons seriously and literally. Seriously and literally, and Brigham Young gave a lot of these blood atonement sermons. All right, and these teachings of blood atonement originated with the prophet Joseph Smith. Sally Denton points this out in her book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre, entitled American Massacre, The Tragedy at Mountain Meadows, September 1857, when it occurred, and it came out in 2003. Denton traces the causes of the Mountain Meadows Massacre directly to Joseph Smith. She wrote that Smith organized a secret group of loyalists called the Danites. These assassins operated under a belief in Smith's most divisive and fanatical doctrine, which Denton averred was the ritualized form of murder called blood atonement. And Brigham Young really took those sermons by Joseph Smith and ran with them and really extrapolated a lot of the sins that a person needs to be blood atoned for. In other words, having your own blood shed. For instance, cutting your throat and letting the blood drip into the ground as an atoning incense up to God. And Sally Denton continues, there would follow untold numbers of such murders, euphemistically called savings, because it was saving their souls, at the hands of the Danites. Among the first charter members to be personally selected by Joseph Smith for his elite avenging army was John D. Lee. So he was one of these Danites, and he knew all about blood atonement. Blood atonement was probably a big factor in why they killed this wagon train. All right, so since blood atonement is such a controversial topic in the Mormon Church, of course, Mormon writers are not going to talk that much about it. It is mentioned in the Mormon book that just came out in 2000, not just came out, it came out in 2008. It's called Massacre at Mountain Meadows. This is the church's big book of them supposedly coming clean and telling the truth about the Mountain Meadows. But they don't really quite do it. This book was written by Mormon authors Richard E. Turley, I think he's a church historian, Ronald W. Walker, and Glenn M. Leonard, probably formerly at BYU. But in this book, they barely deal with blood atonement. So how can they say they're being fully honest now and they're not really talking much about blood atonement? Okay, so let's talk briefly about some of the details of what the Mountain Meadow Massacre was. We're not going to get into this very much because it's not the purpose of this video. The purpose of this video is to document the cover-up. But just basically here on a couple slides, the Mountain Meadows Massacre was a series of attacks on the Baker Fancher immigrant wagon train at Mountain Meadows in southern Utah, south of Cedar City. The attacks began on September 7 and culminated on September 11, 1857, resulting in the mass slaughter of most in the immigrant party by Utah Mormon settlers, together with some southern Paiute Native Americans. But it was planned and organized by the Mormons. Okay, so the numbers here for Mountain Meadows Massacre, 120 men, women, and children were killed. 30 were women and 50 were children. So most of this wagon train were women and children. So that does not look good for the church, killing women and children. 17 children were under the age of 7 and were spared as innocent blood. They hadn't reached the age of accountability, I guess, 8 years old when you get baptized. So they were spared. They thought that they wouldn't really be old enough to tell the tale. And one of the things the Mormon Church is still saying today, and it's still said by people like Turley, is that the Indians killed all the women and children. So they're finally admitting that the Mormons participated in the crime. But of course, the Mormons didn't kill any of the women and children. When all the women and children ran into the bushes, it was only the Indians who chased them and killed them. But we're going to have several slides on that later. All right, so the main book that we're going to use to document this cover-up is Blood of the Prophets, Brigham Young and the Massacre at Mountain Meadows by Will Bagley, the awesome historian. He documented a lot of the things that are missing, a lot of the cover-up. A lot of this was in footnotes. I read this entire book and dug through the footnotes to find a lot of these missing documents, destroyed documents, cover-up things. We're going to use this book. It's a very good book. He spent over 6 years gathering all this data. He did an extremely deep dive into this stuff, going through all of the most obscure sources that you can imagine. He dug out, and you know, I've made quite a few videos, so I know what an obscure source is. Will Bagley did a deep dive through all of that all across the country. He went into all these major archives, all these major libraries, uncovered as much of the documents as he could. Of course, a lot of them are missing, a lot of them are destroyed, which we're going to talk about in this video. Okay, so just a slide on some more information about Bagley's book, Blood of the Prophets. It came out in September 2002 on the University of Oklahoma Press. 544 pages, very well documented, tons of footnotes. All right, so a little bit more about Will Bagley. He's really the historian's historian. He is a historian specializing in the Western United States and the American Old West. He's written about the fur trade, overland immigration, American Indians, military history, frontier violence, railroads, mining, and Utah and the Mormons. He was raised a member of the Mormon Church. He's no longer a member and no longer active, no longer believing. In 2014, the Utah State Historical Society granted Bagley its most prestigious honor as a fellow, joining the ranks of such luminaries as Dale Morgan, Wallace Stegner, Juanita Brooks, and Leonard Arrington. Western Writers of America gave Bagley his 2019 Owen Wister Award for lifetime contributions to Western literature in 2019. He's published extensively over the years and is still active. He is the author and editor of 20 books and many articles and reviews in professional journals such as the Western Historical Quarterly, Utah Historical Quarterly, Overland Journal, and the Journal of Mormon History. He has given academic papers at the annual conventions of the Western History Association, the Mormon History Association, Sunstone, etc. Mr. Bagley was a research associate at Yale University Bernanke Library in 2000 and was the Yale University Bernanke Library Archibald Hanna Jr. Fellow in American History in 2009. He has worked as a historical consultant for National Geographic Magazine, the National Park Service, the Wyoming State Historical Preservation Office, the Nevada Humanities Council, and for more than a dozen documentary films, including the Mountain Meadows Massacre on A&E and the Mormon Rebellion on A&E, and PBS's The Mormons. You can look on his Wikipedia page and look at dozens and dozens of other rewards and accolades that he has received. Okay, from the Blood of the Prophets book Wikipedia page, says Blood of the Prophets updated Juanita Brooks's seminal history, the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and remains one of the definitive works on the topic. And Brigham D. Madsen also made a statement about Blood of the Prophets. He's a fellow Utah historian, and he said, while the word definitive is often overused, this account of the killings, this Blood of the Prophets, merits that distinction. It is the definitive work. Bagley's book ranks as a Mormon historical classic, and I would definitely agree with that. It's a Mormon historical classic. This statement was in the Western Historical Quarterly. Madsen is pictured above. All right, Caroline Fraser, pictured above. She reviewed Blood of the Prophets in the New York Review of Books in 2002. She says, Blood of the Prophets is an exhaustive, meticulously documented, highly readable history that captures the events and atmosphere that gave rise to the massacre. Bagley has taken great care in negotiating the minefield presented by what remains of the historical record. So it's interesting what remains of it, because a lot of it has been destroyed, which this video will document. Okay, some Blood of the Prophets awards and praise. It won the Spur Award, Western Writers of America, Kahi Book Prize, Western History Association, Caroline Bancroft History Prize, Denver Public Library, Co-Founders Best Book Award, Westerners International, and 2003 Best Book Award from John Whitmer Historical Association. So that's pretty high praise. A lot of awards for this book. All right, Blood of the Prophets has been reviewed by a lot of Mormon scholars. That is always a good sign that it's a book that they are concerned about. It's a book that they want to do apologetic works about. So it's always a good sign if a lot of the Mormon apologists are paying attention to you and trying to fight back against something that you published, a book, an article, etc. So Mormon writer Robert D. Crockett did a review. Review of books on the Book of Mormon. I guess he's a lawyer. That was a 58-page review. BYU history professor Thomas G. Alexander did a review in BYU Studies. Professor at Bowling Green University Lawrence Coates, another Mormon professor, did a review in BYU Studies. BYU professor Paul H. Peterson did a review in BYU Studies. University of Utah professor W. Paul Reeve and historian artist E. Parshall, Mormon Historical Studies, did a review. I imagine those two are Mormons as well. So, yeah, like I said, they're concerned with this book, so this is actually good. And Bagley has made claims that the Mormon Church has spent up to $20 million fighting his book. One of the main things they did is they did a lot of research to put out their own book. This was the book by Turley, Walker, and Leonard. Took them like 6 or 7 years to come up with this book. They went all over the country as well and gathered as much sources and data as they could. Of course, the book is still slanted in the Mormon Church's favor. Basically, they're just trying to move the goalposts now, as they've been forced to admit so many facts concerning Mormon involvement in Mountain Meadows Massacre. They're moving the goalposts now and trying to protect the prophet Brigham Young, trying to say that he had nothing to do with this massacre, that he did not order it. That's where the goalpost remains today in 2020. Okay, another statement here by Bagley. He said the enormous lie that was manufactured to protect Brigham Young is an indictment all by itself. The lie, the cover-up, that's what this video is about. This statement was in the California Territorial Quarterly. Okay, a statement by Ken Sanders, owner of Ken Sanders Rare Books in Utah. He's pictured above here. They did a video with the authors of Massacre at Mountain Meadows, C-SPAN video in his bookstore. He made the following comment. After 151 years, on behalf of the LDS Church, of originally denying that there was a massacre, covering the massacre up, pretending it didn't exist, blaming it on the Indians, the church is owning the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It's been long overdue, and I would say they're still not completely owning up to it. They don't deal with blood atonement very well. Turley is still saying things like the Indians were the ones who killed all the women and children. That's not what it says in Bagley's book, not what it says in other non-Mormon histories of the massacre. So, yeah, for the church, that's about as good as you're going to get of owning up to it. They're probably never going to admit that Brigham Young was behind it. Okay, another statement by Bagley. This was at a speech at the 8th Annual Ex-Mormon Conference in 2002, one of my favorite conferences that I watch on YouTube and online. Bagley says, the Deseret News has never printed an honest word about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and they still refuse to do it. This is up until 2002, and they did an ad hominem attack on Bagley, personal attacks. One of them was in an article entitled Massacre Book Has an Axe to Grind, and they're talking about Blood of the Prophets. The Deseret News calls it an anti-Mormon tract and which compares Brigham Young to Hitler. So these are more of the lies that the church's Deseret News newspaper is telling. They don't give Bagley credit as being one of the best Western historians out there. They call it an anti-Mormon tract when the book is around 500 pages. They call it a tract, and he never uses the word Hitler in the book. So these are more lies from the Deseret News. Okay, a statement here from the Utah Indian Curriculum Project, 2009. This is on the Paiute Indians DVD for this curriculum project. And finally, Utah curriculum and history in the schools is being honest about Mountain Meadows Massacre. We're going to go through a lot of the textbooks that they used in the early days of the state and the church, and just show how dishonest they used to be. All the history books used to be written by Mormons. Anyway, more than 150 years would pass before the Mormon church would acknowledge local members of their church as the moving force behind the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So they were in denial and in a cover-up for 150 years, and they're still partially in a cover-up. All right, another statement by Bagley. This is at the same speech at the 8th Annual Ex-Mormon Conference. When they launched an ad hominem attack on this book, personal attacks against Bagley himself, the Deseret News, chose to lie. Okay, Josiah F. Gibbs, he wrote an early book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre in 1910. He said Mormon historians and subsidized writers, I like how he puts that, subsidized writers, and really all the Mormon historians are subsidized as well because they get their paycheck and their retirement from the church. And if you go against the church, you get your membership removed and you get kicked out of BYU, etc. Okay, Mormon historians and subsidized writers have submerged the truth and endeavored to shift the burden of the terrible crime of Mountain Meadows Massacre to the Indians. This is going to be a common theme that we're going to see in this video. Shifting the burden to the Indians. Many are now demanding that the truth be told. Okay, another statement here from Will Bagley's speech. I transcribed 800 pages of original source material. That's pretty impressive. I transcribed a good proportion of the Mountain Meadows Massacre file at the LDS archives, which is the remnants of the old subject file. This is what I'm talking about, him digging through all these records and archives. And I was able to get at it and get through it before the Mormon Church, went through and did another selective purge. So Bagley talking about the Mormon Church doing purges on the Mountain Meadows Massacre file at LDS archives. And even in 2002, they were not done yet purging. And we're going to show some more evidence for this as we go along. And Bagley continues, since the publication of Bagley's book, other people who have tried to go through the same LDS archives have been denied access. So it looks like he got there at a pretty good time. Okay, a statement here by the historian Nels Anderson in his book, Deseret Saints, The Mormon Frontier in Utah, kind of an older book that came out in 1942, one of the better books for its time. He says church officials did attempt for years to block all investigation of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Okay, another statement here by Juanita Brooks. In her seminal book, The Mountain Meadows Massacre, which came out in 1950, I believe this is in the preface or the introduction. She says, "We, the Mormons, have tried to blot out the affair of Mountain Meadows Massacre from our history. We tried to blot it out. It must not be referred to, much less discussed openly." So that's how it was back in Juanita Brooks's time, around 1950. All right, Bagley continues in the same speech. I have been informed that Andrew Jensen, longtime assistant church historian, describes consigning documents to the flames because they were so embarrassing. So, wow, going through your the archives in the church library and consigning documents to the flames. Horrible. Okay, another statement by Juanita Brooks in her book. Brigham Young was an accessory after the fact in that he knew what had happened and how and why it happened, and yet he ultimately allowed the blame for the massacre to be unjustly shouldered by John D. Lee. He was the scapegoat, and unjustly shouldered on the Indian allies as well. So that's what Juanita Brooks came up with, that Brigham Young was an accessory after the fact. Bagley talks about Brigham Young being the one who ordered it. Okay, Bagley again in the same speech. Many of the most incriminating documents have long since been destroyed, and this was even admitted to by one of the authors of the forthcoming Mormon version of the book Massacre at Mountain Meadows. That's the church's version. Came out in 2008 by Turley et al., etc. Even admitted by them that the most incriminating documents have long since been destroyed. So it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, to definitively prove that Brigham Young ordered these attacks, although that's what Bagley believes, although the evidence is not 100% there. All right, a statement here by the historian Robert M. Utley. This is from the Journal of Military History, 2003. Ever since 1857, the Mormon Church has vehemently exempted itself and Brigham Young from any complicity in this crime of Mountain Meadows, which was a crime against humanity. Church-approved histories embrace this interpretation when they mention it at all. So this was kind of a hidden topic, a taboo topic. For a long time, silence was the recommendation by the general authorities. They didn't like to mention it. Okay, so Utley continues. The official church historians and custodians of the massive church archives have carefully avoided the issue of Mountain Meadows Massacre. Parts of the archives have been lost, restricted, sanitized, and even manufactured. So that's what the Mormon Church has done with the record of this, and you know, I kind of don't blame them. If I was responsible for an organization that committed mass murder, I'd probably want to hide it too. Okay, Utley continues. Mormon historians who probe beyond the prescribed limits face isolation at best and excommunication at worst. And this is in 2003, so 17 years ago. Okay, so we now get to this, the first statement here from Blood of the Prophets, and we're going to go through quite a few of these in the book. Bagley says, LDS scholars have dismissed early Mormon religious violence too casually and have neglected the devastating impact that the crime and its cover-up had on the LDS Church and Brigham Young's reputation. Yep, this was a big one. To blame the church, blame Brigham Young. That's why it was a taboo subject for so long. All right, statement here from the prophet Wilford Woodruff. It's kind of an apologetic or a cover-up like statement. Woodruff says, this church was no more responsible for the Mountain Meadows Massacre than any Christian church is for the atrocities that may be committed by persons professing to be its members. Well, if Brigham Young ordered it, that's certainly not the case. And even if he didn't, we have 2 stake presidents, a bishop, other leaders, kind of in mid-level management leaders that were responsible for it. And it was done according to church religious belief and blood atonement. All right, back to Bagley. A veil of silence has shrouded the truth about Mountain Meadows. All right, so back to the account from the prophet Wilford Woodruff. This is 1891, a letter. He says, the Mountain Meadows Massacre is a dead issue. We don't need to talk about it anymore. Let's forget about it. It's a dead issue. He was hoping it was a dead issue in 1891. Little did he know there'd be all kinds of books, articles in scholarly journals, newspapers, etc., still talking about it, still having heated debates 130 years later in 2020. Okay, back to Bagley and his book. So little authentic material about the massacre survives that it suggests a concerted official effort to eliminate any mention of the subject in Mormon annals. And I'm going to show more evidence for this later on. Okay, more cover-up here by the prophet Wilford Woodruff, same source, 1891. They credit the Mormons with lives which are models of decorum, yet they assert that the Mormons massacred men, women, and children at Mountain Meadows. All this is a libel upon the Latter-day Saints. Defamation of character, a libel, a lie. It's not true. Basically, he's covering things up here. The prophet Wilford Woodruff, basically trying to say, no, we Mormons didn't massacre men, women, and children. So he's probably going to just blame it on the Indians. And back to Bagley. More probably, this odd silence in the historical record reflects remarkable self-censorship. Because, yeah, if you did talk about it, you'd get into trouble. In the olden days, you might even be blood atoned or kicked out of town. Okay, so the Apostle John A. Widstow very rarely talked about Mountain Meadows. But he did do one short article in the Improvement Era in 1951. It was entitled, Was Brigham Young Responsible for the Mountain Meadows Massacre? August 1951 edition of the Improvement Era. As he was doing a serial articles for his book, Evidences and Reconciliations. So this is one of the articles that initially went into that book. He says, on September 14, 1857, the Fancher party were attacked and more than 120 persons killed by a band of Indians in company, so it is said, with some white people. So basically saying, yeah, it was the Indians who did it with some white people. He doesn't say it was Mormons. How obvious of an omission is that? Just some white people, random white people? So yeah, not taking responsibility for it. And here's the cover of the August 1951 Improvement Era. It's got J. Reuben Clark on the front. This was the edition or the month and year where the John A. Widstow article appeared. Okay, back to Bagley here. And in this book, he documents all these missing or destroyed sources. And one of them was John D. Lee's 1857 diary. I guess a section of that is gone, which really would have helped us understand Mountain Meadows better. All right, so back to Apostle Widstow's article in the Improvement Era. He's doing some apologetics here. He says, just what were the causes of the massacre and who, aside from the Indians, were participants are not really known. We don't really know if any Mormons participated. We know maybe there's a couple white people, but aside from the Indians, we don't really know who did it. Okay, back to Bagley and John D. Lee's 1857 diary. Emma Lee, I guess that was John D. Lee's wife, allegedly said that 3 men came to Lonely Dell. That was John D. Lee's ferry. They came to Lonely Dell looking for Lee's 1857 diary. Some said that this journal contained Lee's own story of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Emma Lee said that the men burned it. Destroying evidence. All right, statement from John D. Lee and William Bishop's book, Mormonism Unveiled, 1877. John D. Lee himself believed that most of his private writings and journals had been destroyed, or at least kept from him. He had delivered several journals to Brigham Young. He was the adoptive son of Brigham Young, so they were kind of close. Gave his journals to Brigham Young and never could get them again. They were taken and either destroyed or hidden. Okay, so back to the Apostle John A. Widstow. We've talked about his article about Mountain Meadows Massacre in the Improvement Era, August 1951. And we talked about how that was a serial articles that eventually became his 3-volume work, Evidences and Reconciliations, and that this article on the Mountain Meadows Massacre found its way into the 3rd volume of John A. Widstow's book, Evidences and Reconciliations. So in all of Widstow's many books on church history and doctrine, the only place he mentions the Mountain Meadows Massacre was in his book, Evidences and Reconciliations, Volume 3, 1951, first edition. That's important to note. Only in the first edition. This is something I discovered through a little research, and which the article was originally in the Improvement Era. But after the first edition, this chapter in the Evidences and Reconciliations was removed in all subsequent editions. So the church decided it really wasn't that comfortable with John A. Widstow talking about this, giving, some fairly crappy apologetic arguments. And so it was completely removed in all subsequent editions. You can't find it in there anymore. So that's John A. Widstow, and that is pretty much, as far as I know, all the stuff I searched through. That's pretty much the only time he ever mentioned it, and he wrote a lot of books on church history and doctrine. All right, so when Apostle Dallin H. Oaks was growing up in high school and college, he heard the Mormon cover-up story. He even admits this in the PBS documentary, The Mormons, which came out in 2007. He says, when I was in high school or college, he heard that the terrible atrocity of Mountain Meadows Massacre was perpetuated by the Indians in southern Utah. So he's admitting that that's what he heard growing up, the cover-up story. All right, back to Bagley and Blood of the Prophets. Sorry I don't list the page numbers in these early slides. It was an omission on my part. Later on in the video, I do give the page numbers for Blood of the Prophets, but Anyway, he says missing or destroyed sources include the minutes of the Cedar City church meeting whose participants voted to kill the immigrants. So those minutes of that Cedar City church meeting are gone. Here we have a picture of Cedar City, historic downtown Utah. And just as a side note, I was born in Cedar City. So not too far from where all this Mountain Meadows Massacre went down. All right, a statement here by Sarah B. Gordon and Jan Ships in an article in the Journal of the Early Republic, summer of 2017, so pretty recent. The cover on here of the Journal of the Early Republic is a different cover than 2017. It's a 2015 cover. Anyway, that's kind of what the cover looks like. Brigham Young and other Mormon leaders quickly learned the truth about Mountain Meadows Massacre, although they never made it public. They would say other things in public. They would give apologetic arguments and, blame it on the Indians, etc. But they're saying in this article, Brigham Young quickly learned the truth, although they never made it public. Okay, back to Bagley. Other missing or destroyed sources include correspondence between the local militia commanders and Brigham Young. Wouldn't that be nice to have? Nope, missing or destroyed. And back to Ken Sanders, owner of Ken Sanders Rare Books in Utah. An interview here with Peggy Fletcher Stack in the Salt Lake Tribune, 2008. He says there was a systematic effort to cover up and destroy records, diaries, and court records of the day. And this is regarding Mountain Meadows Massacre. Systematic effort to cover up and destroy records, diaries, and court records. All right, back to Bagley. Missing or destroyed sources include pages ripped from dozens of 1857 journals, kind of as pictured above, ripped out, thrown away, or burned. From dozens of 1857 journals. So this was a pretty thorough, massive, systematic cover-up. Okay, back to Ken Sanders. The Mountain Meadows Massacre has been swept under the rug, denied, and hidden for 151 years. This is in that same article in 2008. Okay, back to Bagley. It is worth noting that these works by supposed anti-Mormon writers T.B.H. Stenhouse and John H. Beadle have proven to be more reliable than virtually anything printed in official LDS sources until well into the 20th century. All right, statement by B.H. Roberts in his Comprehensive History of the Church, 1930, regarding Mountain Meadows Massacre. He says, it is conceded that Latter-day Saints have been naturally slow to admit all the facts that history may insist upon as inevitable. Slow to admit all the facts. So, being somewhat honest, he's one of the more honest Mormon historians. Okay, another statement here by Bagley. In their desire to exonerate Brigham Young of any guilt, official Mormon accounts of the crime laid the blame on the victims and the Indians. So, yeah. You can always blame the victims. They did something to provoke the Indians and the Mormons, but yeah, they really like to lay the blame on the Indians. Okay, a statement here by the Mormon writer Francis M. Gibbons. He's done a ton of biographies on church leaders. This one is Brigham Young, Modern Moses, Prophet of God, 1981. Most of these biographies are very faith-promoting, but I thought this was an interesting statement. He says, Mountain Meadows Massacre was shrouded by a cloak of secrecy and conspiracy among those that were involved. And of course, Gibbons is pictured above. And back to Bagley. The modern LDS Church wishes the world to simply forget the most disturbing episode in its history. We're not going to forget it. It's mass murder. It's the kind of stuff that you'd expect Charles Manson to do, or a psychopath to do, or, you know, murderers, serial killers. Okay, a statement here by Stanley Hershon in The Lion of the Lord. Biography about Brigham Young in 1969. Apostle Brigham Young Jr., son of Brigham Young, blamed Mountain Meadows Massacre on the Indians. So that's interesting. We're just going to point out the lies of different apostles and church leaders blaming Mountain Meadows Massacre on the Indians. So Brigham Young Jr.'s son, that's what he did. All right, back to Bagley. The Fancher party, and that's what we're going to call them in this video, was long caricatured by Mormons as a horde of faceless ruffians. The party's large number of women and children cast doubt on folklore that pictures its journey west as a drunken and murderous rampage. They really weren't. Like he says, most of them were women and children, Christians, peacefully trying to cross the plains to get to California. You know, they'd have to be crazy to try to pick a fight with Mormons who were suspicious of Gentiles, as they call them, coming through, you know. All right, we have a statement here by the prophet Brigham Young. This showed up in the Mountain Meadows Massacre with the life, confession, and execution of John D. Lee, the Mormon, 1877. Stanley Hershon points out this source. So a statement from the prophet Brigham Young, supposedly: keep all secret as the grave, never tell anyone, and write me a long letter laying all the blame on the Indians. I will report to the U.S. government that it was an Indian massacre. So this was their first attempt for cover-up. Okay, back to Bagley. Once the Fancher party left Salt Lake, it disappeared into a historical maze built of lies, folklore, popular myth, justifications, and few facts. That's what the Mormons had to say about it. Okay, Bagley continues. Regarding the Mountain Meadows Massacre, Mormons carefully controlled what they let the outlanders see and hear. So it's carefully controlled. And another statement from Bagley. The Mormons skillfully crafted legends shrouding the fate of these murdered and maligned people, the Fancher party, making penetrating this mythology extremely difficult. So they came up with all the mythology that it was the Indians, you know, etc. The poison story had too many problems to serve the saints well. So there was a story that the Fancher party, the immigrants, had poisoned water, poisoned cows, and killed some Indians. It's not true. Even Turley, etc., admit that story is not true. Without the poison tales, there is no proof that the Fancher party did anything to provoke Utah's Indians. Okay, Bagley continues. Despite the lack of credible evidence, some historians continue to assert as a fact that on the road south, members of the Fancher party provoked and abused the Paiutes. And he's talking about Ronald K. Esplin and Dean C. Jesse in the Arkansas Times in 1984. Still saying that the Fancher party provoked and abused the Paiutes. Not true. All right, the Apostle George A. Smith believed that some evil would befall the Fancher party before they got through. That's weird. Why did he think some evil would befall them? Well, maybe he knew about something in advance. George A. Smith's comment appears to be the reason that a page was cut from the LDS Archives copy of Jacob Hamblin's journal. A page was cut out from Jacob Hamblin's journal. Hamblin is pictured above. Okay, the day before the attack at Mountain Meadows, Sunday, September 6, 1857, the LDS Historical Office Journal recorded that Apostle George A. Smith, pictured above, spent part of the day writing letters to Stake President William H. Dame, who is one of the responsible parties for ordering the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So writing letters to Stake President William H. Dame, and of course, the letters do not survive in the LDS archives. Wouldn't it be nice to have those? Okay, also from Bagley's book, Blood of the Prophets, one Mormon scholar said that the Fancher party provoked the town of Cedar City with violent attacks, and that Mormon scholar is Thomas G. Alexander. Review of David L. Bigler's Forgotten Kingdom, New Mexico Historical Review in 1999. Thomas G. Alexander is pictured above. I am familiar with his work, and a lot of his stuff only tells half the story. Okay, another statement in Bagley's book. Historian Donald Mormon, author of Camp Floyd and the Mormons, pictured above, apparently had access to an earlier and more complete version of this collection, which was the Charles Wilden Affidavit, etc., than the one that is now available, since many of the items he cited cannot be located at LDS archives, so more missing material. And Bagley continues, Donald R. Mormon cited an 1896 Samuel Knight affidavit. Like many sources that Mormon apparently saw at the LDS archives, these documents are not in the current collection, but they should be, because Mormon saw them earlier on. And Mormon cited a letter from John C. Chatterley to Andrew Jensen, September 18, 1919, and this document cannot be located at LDS archives, so a lot of missing stuff. All right, another statement by Bagley. Tribal chiefs Tootsagabit and Youngwoods, not sure how you say those, were said to have been at the massacre. According to Mormon, these two Indian leaders had met with Brigham Young only a week before the attack, and of course this information is no longer in the LDS archives files, so a lot of missing stuff. This is just a general tribal chief picture here. Okay, Stake President Isaac Haight, pictured above, sent a message to Brigham Young asking whether they should continue the assault on the Fancher party, and of course no copy of this critical message has survived. Okay, a potentially important source or resource for the Mountain Meadows Massacre is the diary of Francis M. Lyman, pictured above. The original diaries are in the possession of the First Presidency of the LDS Church and are not available to scholars. Wonder why not. Okay, a statement here in C.P. Lyford's book, The Mormon Problem, 1886. One man who escaped from the massacre as a messenger had with him a document which included the names of all the Fancher immigrants and an itemized list of their property. The Mormons or Indians tracked him down and killed him. John D. Lee destroyed the document. Okay, and again from Lyford's book, two other men also escaped from the massacre as messengers. The Mormons or Indians tracked them down and killed them as well. So really trying to stop any information from getting out. Okay, another statement from Bagley here. As one of the leading Mormon officials in California, William Matthews began the systematic defamation of the murdered immigrants that presaged the large body of folklore that would vilify the victims to justify the crime. And of course, defamation is the act of communicating false statements about a person that injure the reputation of that person. So certain Mormons were trying to systematically defame the murdered immigrant wagon train from Arkansas. And Matthews also came up with another lie. He said that all the women of the Fancher party were prostitutes. That was a major lie. Okay, and we have some information about John D. Lee and Brigham Young here, also in the Blood of the Prophets book. John D. Lee met with Brigham Young on Monday evening as he claimed. After praying about the matter, Brigham Young ordered Lee to keep the whole thing as a sacred secret and lay the blame to the Indians. So that's pretty interesting. That's supposedly what Brigham Young said. Keep the whole thing as a sacred secret and lay the blame on the Indians. And that's exactly what the church did for many, many years. John D. Lee, pictured above, said that Brigham Young told him to write a report as Indian farmer, which he was, laying the blame on the Indians. So according to John D. Lee, that's what Brigham Young told him to do, lay the blame on the Indians. All right, another statement here. This is from Anna J. Backus, Mountain Meadows Witness, 1995, page 157. Brigham Young in the Beehive House turned to Bishop Klingensmith, he's pictured above, and said, dispose of that property, let John D. Lee take charge of it. And I believe that property was taken from the Fancher wagon train after they had killed them. And then Brigham Young warned the men, what you know about this, say nothing about it. So again, Brigham Young telling the people to keep it a secret. All right, Indian Agent Garland Hurt, who was a non-member, not a Mormon, he's pictured above. He knew too much about events at Mountain Meadows and was driven out of the territory. So interesting, this is a common theme. Those who knew too much were persecuted or driven out of the territory. Okay, and this comes from John D. Lee's book or journals, Mormonism Unveiled, 1877. In there it says, as Indian superintendent, Brigham Young submitted his report to the Indian Commissioner James Denver, and Denver is pictured above. And so this is what Brigham Young said in his report to Denver. Captain Fancher and company fell victim to the Indians' wrath near Mountain Meadows. So there we have Brigham Young blaming it on the Indians in his report to Indian Commissioner James Denver. And also, according to Bagley, we have the Apostle George A. Smith, pictured above, who also blamed the massacre on the Indians as well. So this is a common theme from the apostles and prophets of the time. George A. Smith, an apostle in the LDS Church, blamed the massacre on the Indians as well. Okay, a statement or an account here in Leonard J. Arrington's book, Brigham Young, American Moses, 1985. The church likes you to believe this is the seminal biography of Brigham Young, but it's still somewhat apologetical. But in there it says, Jacob Hamblin said that Brigham Young told him, as soon as we can get a court of justice, we will ferret this thing out. And he's talking about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. He really had no intention to ferret this thing out, but that's what he told Hamblin. And then Brigham Young said, but until then, don't say anything about it. So keep it a secret, cover it up, the whole whitewash. And of course, we have Arrington, the church historian, pictured above. All right, and we also have an account here from the Mormon historian Juanita Brooks, talking about some of the reports by Apostle George A. Smith regarding the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And Brooks says that Smith's reports were a deliberate attempt to befog or confuse the affair and direct attention away from any possibility of Mormon implication. That was the purpose of George A. Smith's reports. Confuse the affair, direct attention away from it, and direct attention away from any Mormon responsibility. All right, a little bit more about the Apostle George A. Smith. Rather than search for the truth, George A. Smith wanted to determine who could be blamed for the massacre, and his several hearings demonstrated that no one in southern Utah wanted to shoulder the responsibility. So they're all trying to get out of being prosecuted here. Okay, another statement by Bagley. Some told of a reign of terror aimed at suppressing the news of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Zephaniah J. Warren was pulled from a sickbed, dragged down a road, and thrown into a ditch. So his body was thrown into a ditch. Pictured above, we have a car in a ditch. Anyway, he was allowed to live as long as he kept quiet. But they're basically threatening him, pulling him out of his sickbed, throwing him in a ditch, and probably warning him that if you don't keep your mouth shut, we're going to kill you. So that's what they told Zephaniah J. Warren. All right, the Judge John Cradlebow, pictured above, made a statement regarding the Justice Department in the Utah Territory. I guess you could call it the Justice Department. He called attention to the great number of long ignored crimes in the district. He said there was an effort to cover up instead of bring to light and punish crime in the Utah Territory. And there's no better example of that than the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Okay, another statement here by Cradlebow. He ended up not liking the Mormons. He didn't like Brigham Young, the theocracy, all the crimes that went unpunished. Cradlebow spoke passionately of the horrible crime at Mountain Meadows, which had been ignored for so long that the failure to act indicated that there is some person high in the estimation of the people by whose authority it was committed. So maybe it was ordered by somebody higher than the stake presidents. Maybe general authorities in the 70s, maybe general authorities in the apostleship, or maybe Brigham Young himself. All right, and Charles Kelly, who put together some of the journals of John D. Lee, Charles Kelly indicated that 16 pages were missing from John D. Lee's 1859 diary. It says 16 pages now missing apparently contain John D. Lee's story of the Mountain Meadows murders. But they're gone, kind of as pictured above here. All right, still with Bagley's book here, the Apostle George Q. Cannon, pictured above, also blamed the massacre on the Indians. In the book, it says Apostle George Q. Cannon wrote the last church editorial blaming the massacre on the Indians in 1869. So we see this is a trend amongst many of the apostles and even Brigham Young himself. All right, so also in Bagley's book, we have the idea here that Brigham Young did not do very much to secure justice for the dead. Wasn't really too concerned about bringing those responsible to justice because they were members of his church. They were stake presidents, bishops, other people in southern Utah. Brigham Young actually did the opposite and tried to protect them. But in the book it says Brigham Young was acknowledged as the most powerful man in Utah, but he did nothing to secure the justice for the dead and the orphaned of Mountain Meadows. All right, another statement from Bagley. The involvement of high church leaders in preventing prosecution of the crime reveals the level of support that the killers received. Throughout the summer of 1859, that's a couple years after the massacre, Mormon leaders resisted growing pressure from the federal authorities to bring the perpetrators of the massacre to justice. They resisted growing pressure from the federal authorities to bring the perpetrators to justice. Brigham Young did nothing to further the prosecution of the crime. Brigham Young's obstruction of justice in Utah delayed the prosecution of the Mountain Meadows criminals. For 14 years, Young's power stopped any federal prosecution of the crime. Once Governor Alfred Cumming was dead and unable to defend his record, Brigham Young blamed him for the long delay in justice. And Cumming was just basically a lackey of Brigham Young. He did whatever Brigham Young told him to do. All right, another statement by Bagley here. And subsequent generations of Mormon historians also shifted the onus for the embarrassing failure to prosecute the crime to the hapless Georgian, which was Cummings. You can read this statement up above by Elder Boy K. Packer, an apostle in the Mormon Church. He said, when Elder Packer interviewed me, he explained that the truth is not uplifting, it destroys. So sometimes, truth should not be talked about, especially if it's not uplifting. And this was an interview, it looks like, with D. Michael Quinn, who got into trouble for teaching things that were true. And so he got excommunicated and kicked out of BYU, along with the other September 6. Okay, in May of 1861, Brigham Young visited southern Utah. A key purpose of the excursion was to ensure that southern Utahns understood the need for silence on the subject of Mountain Meadows. There was a need for silence, according to Brigham Young, regarding the subject of Mountain Meadows. Brigham Young told John D. Lee that those who revealed the secret of Mountain Meadows Massacre would be damned and go down to hell. Revealing the secret truth of Mountain Meadows, if you did that, you'd go to hell. In public, Brigham Young mourned that justice was delayed, but in private, he made sure nothing was done to bring the killers to trial. And that is such a common Mormon theme. Saying one thing to the public, basically lying to the public, lying for the Lord, and then in private, making sure that nothing was done, making sure that it was kept quiet and covered up. Okay, here is a speech from the prophet Brigham Young, General Conference, March 8, 1863, Journal of Discourses, Volume 10. Nearly all of that company, the Fancher party, were destroyed by the Indians. That's what he's saying in a speech in General Conference. Nearly all of that company were destroyed by the Indians. And John G. Turner talks about this in his book, Brigham Young, Pioneer Prophet, 2012. Brigham Young placed the full blame for the slaughter at Mountain Meadows on the Paiute Indians. Brigham Young placed the full blame for the slaughter at Mountain Meadows on the Indians. And Wilford Woodruff talked about this in his journal as well, Volume 6, page 306, entry date of December 23, 1866. Brigham Young supposed that those who were massacred at Mountain Meadows were massacred by savages, in other words, Indians or the Paiute Indians. All right, we have another interesting story here in Blood of the Prophets about Olive Coombs. She acted too interested in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. She asked too many questions about it. Word went out that she was collecting evidence and planned to publish her findings. A barroom debate accused her of being a wolf in sheep's clothing. All right, so what happened to Olive Coombs? Well, it tells us in the book, in Bagley's book. George Wood, who is pictured above, who had been a militia officer in Cedar City in 1857, went to Olive Coombs' house and shot her twice, killing her. So that's what you would get if you talked too much about Mountain Meadows, and especially if you tried to publish something about it. Okay, a statement here in Frederick Lockley's The Lee Trial, 1875. John D. Lee may have murdered one of the surviving children. Anne Eliza Hogue testified, and she swore that a boy disappeared after he blamed a man for killing his father. So one of the little boys that was spared, that was too young to tell the tale, blamed a man for killing his father. He's like, hey, I remember you. You're the one that shot my dad. And what happened to the boy? Well, according to Anne Eliza Hogue, the boy disappeared and probably was killed. All right, a similar account can be found in Charles S. Peterson's Life in a Village Society, Utah Historical Quarterly, spring of 1981. It was said that at John D. Lee's home, figs ripened black over the grave of a refugee child from the Mountain Meadows Massacre. That body is providing good fertilizer, good nutrition for the soil. Figs ripened black over the grave of a refugee child from the Mountain Meadows Massacre who was killed and buried by John D. Lee when she talked too much. All right, an account from Anne Eliza Young in her book, Wife Number 19, 19th Wife of Brigham Young. The book came out in 1875. It's got a lot of interesting things in it. Last seen with Bill Hickman, John V. Long was found dead in a ditch. Rumors circulated that as Brigham Young's clerk, Long was the only person who heard the conversation between Brigham and the messenger sent from George A. Smith just before the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and who wrote out the instructions for the man to carry back. So he overheard too much, and so John V. Long was found dead in a ditch, probably killed by Wild Bill Hickman, at least according to Anne Eliza Young. Okay, from an article in the Philadelphia Morning Post, 1869, says, as late as November 1869, Brigham Young Jr. publicly defended the story that the massacre was simply an Indian affair. So here we go. Got another apostle here, Brigham Young Jr., the son of Brigham Young, the prophet. Jr. is pictured above here when he was in his younger days. Okay, some more apologetics from the Apostle George Q. Cannon. Cannon had known the truth for more than a decade, but he claimed that the citizens from Cedar City heard rumors of a battle, but arrived too late to help. Citizens from Cedar City heard rumors of a battle at Mountain Meadows, and they only wanted to help. They only wanted to help save them. But they arrived at Mountain Meadows too late to help. Well, we now know that they did not want to help. They wanted to kill this entire wagon train. Okay, an article here in the Salt Lake Tribune, 1875, says for 12 years the voice of the LDS Church was one of indignant denial that any Mormons were engaged in the affair of Mountain Meadows Massacre. After a few hesitating admissions, in 1871, the whole Mormon people changed front as suddenly as a well-drilled regiment. LDS newspapers had furiously denounced the Salt Lake Tribune for accusing the Mormons of Mountain Meadows Massacre, but the denunciations were now aimed at Haight, Higbee, and Lee. So rather than accept the blame and responsibility at a high level in the church, they had to come up with scapegoats. And they found Haight, Higbee, and Lee as new scapegoats. All right, some information found in Juanita Brooks and Robert Cleland's book, Mormon Chronicle, The Diaries of John D. Lee. It says that Brigham Young now started to blame John D. Lee, and Lee was excommunicated. Lee is pictured above. Lee wanted a rehearing, but the apostle Erastus Snow decided not to investigate further since it would result in no benefit, as the least said at present the better. All right, back to Bagley. The LDS Church made no official statement about the massacre until years after the death of Brigham Young. They made no official statement until after Brigham Young had died in 1877. So what is that? That's at least over 20 years of no official statement. Pictured above, we have Heber C. Kimball, Brigham Young, and Willard Richards. And Utah's probate courts had taken no action on the territory's most notorious crime, Mountain Meadows Massacre. They had taken no action during the 17 years that they claimed the authority to do so, and those probate courts were entirely in the hands of the Mormons. All right, a statement from Brigham Young here. This is found in Collins R. Hakes, To Whom It May Concern, in 1916. Brigham Young said, "The time has come when they will try John D. Lee and not the Mormon Church, and that is all that we have ever wanted. Yes, put all the blame and responsibility on one guy, John D. Lee, and not anybody in the higher-ups of the church. Make him the scapegoat, even though there was 50 to 60 other Mormon men at the massacre, and even though people like Dame and Haight, who were stake presidents, actually above John D. Lee, also had a lot to do with the massacre." All right, another account here of books and records being taken or hidden. This is from Edna Lee Brimhall's Gleanings Concerning John D. Lee. Two men arrived at John D. Lee's ferry to search for books or records. They said the church wanted them, and we always thought that it was to keep the truth hidden. The men sat up all night looking through the books. They both took records of some kind. And the word of mouth was to keep the truth hidden. They're taking probably John D. Lee's books and records. Okay, a statement here by Daniel H. Wells in the Deseret News, 1857. He was an apostle and in the first presidency at this time, 1857. Wells blamed the Mountain Meadows Massacre on John D. Lee, perhaps a crony or two, and a lot of dupes and thieves and savages under his command. Or just basically 50 to 60 Mormon men in southern Utah. He's not going to say that. It was all John D. Lee's fault. Maybe a crony or two, bunch of dupes, thieves, and savages, but, other than that, Mormons really weren't involved. Okay, the church maintained Brigham Young's long-standing policy of silence for years. But by the early 1880s, so 3 years after Brigham Young's death, it was clear that ignoring the problem would not make it go away. All right, in 1892, church historian Andrew Jensen, pictured above, went on a fact-finding expedition regarding the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Fact-finding expedition for the church. He interviewed a number of the old veterans who freely gave him the desired information. But, of course, the notes of Jensen's interviews cannot be located in the LDS Church archives. Two official LDS Church historians noted. So we're seeing a pattern here. All the most damnable evidence just can't seem to be located in church archives, or it's already been burned, purged, or destroyed. All right, a statement by Bagley regarding B.H. Roberts' comprehensive history of the church. B.H. Roberts knew much more about the massacre than his history revealed. So even B.H. Roberts, who is a fairly honest Mormon historian, knew that this was a very taboo topic, and he knew much more about the massacre than he revealed in the comprehensive history of the church. And of course, Roberts is pictured above. All right, some more information about B.H. Roberts. He ignored evidence and glaring inconsistencies in the record. His chapter on responsibility for the massacre evaded the question. He exonerated the LDS Church of any responsibility for the crime. And pictured above, we have a younger picture of Roberts. And this is how B.H. Roberts put it in his comprehensive history of the church. Came out in 1930. This much I hold to be clear. The church bears no stain and carries no responsibility for bloodshed at any time or any place, including the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So that's pretty much a cover-up. He probably knew the stake presidents William Dame, stake president Isaac Haight, Bishop John D. Lee were all involved. You know, so that's mid-level church managers, but he doesn't admit that. Okay, another book that was covered up was Josiah Rogerson's book in 1911. It was a book about the Mountain Meadows Massacre that was put together at the request of the First Presidency. The book was never published, and his transcripts and opus, his book, came to rest in one of the First Presidency's vaults. Only scraps of this work are available. So how much good stuff do we have in the First Presidency's vaults? How much of it has been destroyed? You know, we don't know. They don't tell us. All right, so what about Orson Whitney's 4-volume History of Utah, 1892? He later went on to become an apostle. Well, according to Bagley, History of Utah provided a pro-Mormon interpretation, one consonant with the official church position. Whitney deified Brigham Young, in other words, thought of Brigham Young as a god. The historian Robert Baskin really didn't like Whitney's History of Utah. He said the account in there of the Mountain Meadows Massacre was an infamous libel, defamation, a lie. He said the account was reckless and unscrupulous. And pictured above, we have the reminiscences of early Utah with a reply to certain statements by O.F. Whitney by Robert N. Baskin. So that's one way that they were involved with each other. All right, so here is one example right out of the History of Utah by Whitney. The Mountain Meadows Massacre was unjustly attributed by many to the Mormon Church. Latter-day Saints were in no way responsible. Orson Whitney pictured above here. I believe he went on to become an apostle. Latter-day Saints were in no way responsible. And Casey W. Olson also talks about these accounts by Orson F. Whitney. This is from his PhD dissertation, which was excellent and it really added a lot to this video. It was a PhD dissertation at Utah State University in 2013. The Evolution of History, Changing Narratives of the Mountain Meadows Massacre in Utah's Public School Curricula. He says Whitney chose to reiterate and strengthen the traditional Latter-day Saint narrative that downplayed Mormon culpability. He presented the Paiute Indians, that's Whitney, presented the Paiute Indians as primarily responsible for the Mountain Meadows Massacre, with some local white Mormons assisting. And really it should be the other way around. The local white Mormons are the ones primarily responsible, with some assisting by Paiute Indians. But the Mormons planned it, organized it, and perpetuated it. And pictured above, we have a younger picture of Orson F. Whitney. Okay, a statement here by Anthon Lee. This is from Edna Lee Brimhall, Gleanings Concerning John D. Lee in the 1930s. Talks about President and Prophet Joseph F. Smith, pictured above, saying that if he had not been in Hawaii at the time of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, but if he was in southern Utah, he would no doubt have been in the midst of the fray. In other words, he would have participated in the massacre. So obviously, President Joseph F. Smith thought there was a good reason to kill the Fancher party. Maybe he thought they were responsible for Joseph and Hiram Smith's murders. Maybe he thought they were responsible for murdering Parley P. Pratt. Not sure what his reasons were. Okay, also from the same account by Anthon Lee, he talks about President and Prophet Heber J. Grant, a statement from him concerning Mountain Meadows Massacre. Grant is pictured above. He said that Heber J. Grant said, "I would have been in it too." In other words, I would have been in Mountain Meadows Massacre, or I hope that I would. He also advised that this affair should never be mentioned. So again, President and Prophet Heber J. Grant also thought that there must be a good reason to kill this wagon train. My best guess is that they probably thought that they were responsible for killing Joseph, Hiram, and Parley. Okay, back to Bagley. Interesting tidbit here about Heber J. Grant. He's also pictured here. Grant worked hard to obliterate the memory of John D. Lee. So at first they made him the scapegoat, but then Grant really didn't want him to be remembered, as a mass murderer, as being excommunicated and then executed. It's all kind of controversial stuff, so I guess Grant worked hard to obliterate the memory of John D. Lee. All right, another interesting story about Heber J. Grant here is by Harvard Heath in an item called In the World. He says that Heber J. Grant tried to suppress the story of the massacre. Grant and Reed Smoot asked the writer of an article about the Mountain Meadows Massacre in the Saturday Evening Post. They asked him not to publish it. So interesting, trying to suppress the story. And they did a pretty good job of it. And Reed Smoot also talked about this in his diaries. This can be found in the World, the Diaries of Reed Smoot, which came out in 1997. An entry on Saturday, October 11/30. I met with the First Presidency for a while for the Saturday Evening Post, who had prepared an article for the Post on the early history of the Mormon Church. The article recited all the details of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. President Grant and I considered the article yesterday as the author handed a copy for consideration. We asked him not to publish it. It ended by his promise not to use it, and he took the copy furnished us to read and tore it up and stated that it would not be used. It was a great relief to us all. So that's interesting. And another account in his own journals asking them not to publish it, and apparently they were successful at doing this. Not sure how they were successful or why they were successful. And of course, Reed Smoot is pictured above. He tried to, or I guess he was a senator and an apostle for the church. Okay, we have an affidavit here from Rex E. Lee, pictured above. He was a lawyer and also president of BYU. This affidavit was in 1931. It's in the Gleanings concerning John D. Lee. Church historian Andrew Jensen told John D. Lee's grandson, Rex E. Lee, so that's interesting. Rex E. Lee was the grandson of John D. Lee. Jensen told Rex E. Lee that the truth of Mountain Meadows Massacre had to be suppressed because of President Heber J. Grant. So Grant tried his best to suppress it. Didn't really work. It's too big of a story. And it has continued to be a big issue all the way up to 2020. Okay, another statement by Bagley. The memory of the atrocity endured in southern Utah as a forbidden legend told in whispers, if it was told at all. And residents were reluctant to go too near a story that almost everyone agreed was best left alone. The massacre would remain shrouded in silence until the mid-20th century, when a devout and courageous Mormon historian began to tell its secrets. And of course, that was Juanita Brooks, and in her book, The Mountain Meadows Massacre. Okay, Bagley also talks about Jacob Hamblin's journal. He says the pages of Hamblin's journal describing the massacre had been ripped out. So this is a common theme. All these different journals for this time period, pages were ripped out. So yeah, this can be found in the footnote of Blood of the Prophets. A lot of these did come from footnotes, a lot of this information. And of course, Jacob Hamblin is pictured above. Okay, another statement by Bagley. Affidavits by 8 massacre eyewitnesses taken in 1909 by St. George jurist David H. Morris were given to the Apostle David O. McKay by his daughter. And we have David O. McKay pictured above in his younger years. Okay, so the story continues. Historian Juanita Brooks tried to obtain copies of these affidavits, which we mentioned on the previous slide. David O. McKay refused to meet with her, and she could not get the copies. LDS leaders even refused to discuss the subject. So that's how taboo it was. And again, we have a picture of David O. McKay here in his younger years. So McKay refused to meet with her, and she could never get those copies of the affidavits. And Bagley also talks about Kate B. Carter. She's pictured above here on the right. And legend has it that Carter, president of the Daughters of Utah Pioneers, I think that's a museum, excised and destroyed all references to Mountain Meadows in documents that came into her possession. Kate B. Carter excised and destroyed all references to Mountain Meadows in documents. Carter boasted of burning the critical minutes of the September 6, 1857 Stake High Council meeting in Cedar City, which voted to destroy the Fancher party. Those are critical to understanding what happened. But of course, Carter boasted of burning these minutes. And Russell R. Rich also talks about this in the Mountain Meadows Massacre, page 9. Carter cast it, which was the contents of the minute book, into the fireplace and watched it burn. And Bagley continues here. Juanita Brooks's book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre brought massive evidence that Brigham Young covered up the crime, which made him an accessory after the fact. Juanita Brooks's book also showed that Brigham Young stage managed the sacrifice of John D. Lee. He was a scapegoat. She also talked about other high-ranking LDS church officials' suppression of the truth. Okay, so Juanita Brooks condemned the apostle Joseph Fielding Smith. Takes a lot of balls. Just being a regular member of the church to condemn the apostle Joseph Fielding Smith, who had a lot of power at the time. But she's condemning his thesis in his book Essentials in Church History, which came out initially in 1922. I think it went through a lot of editions. But she condemned the thesis in that book that the massacre was the crime of an individual, only one individual, John D. Lee, the crime of a fanatic of the worst stamp. So that's some of Joseph Fielding Smith's apologetics, blaming it all on John D. Lee. It was the crime of one individual, nobody else. The other 50, 60 people, they weren't really, had nothing to do with it, those other 50, 60 Mormons. The crime of a fanatic of the worst stamp. So this is what Joseph Fielding Smith says in this book. He doesn't talk about it much in his other writings, if at all. So that's pretty interesting. Okay, so here's the full sentence here in Joseph Fielding Smith's book, Essentials in Church History. It says, Mountain Meadows Massacre was the crime of an individual, the crime of a fanatic of the worst stamp, one who was a member of the Mormon Church, Mormon is in quotes, but of whose intentions the church knew nothing. Nobody above him knew anything? William Dame, Isaac Haight, Brigham Young. He was a member of the Mormon Church, but of whose intentions the church knew nothing. And of course, there were actually about 50 to 60 Mormon men who took part in the massacre. You can read about this even on the church's own website, which is now churchofjesuschrist.org. And of course, Smith is pictured above. And then Bagley makes a comment here. As church historian, Joseph Fielding Smith was custodian of records containing abundant evidence to the contrary. In other words, he knew there was a lot more people involved than just John D. Lee. And yeah, Joseph Fielding Smith was a pretty smart guy, and he did quite a bit of research in the church archives. So he knew better. And another statement here in Joseph Fielding Smith's book, Essentials in Church History. He says, the Mountain Meadows Massacre was the deed of enraged Indians. It was the deed of enraged Indians aided by a number of white men. So he's basically pinning the primary blame on the Indians with a number of white men that helped, and really that's turned around. It should be was the deed of enraged Mormons aided by a number of Indians. I would turn that statement around. Here's a picture of Joseph Fielding Smith in the younger days, and also in the same book, Essentials in Church History, Joseph Fielding Smith blames the victim. You know, they were just such evil ruffians that went through the state and caused so much chaos. Not true. Even the Mormon church leaders like Turley and his group admit that now. But this is what it says in his book. The Fancher party were well treated by most of the settlers, and not until their own actions brought upon them the ill will of the southern settlements was this attitude changed. So why did they get attacked? It was their own actions. They brought it upon themselves. So the southern settlements just had to kill them because they were such assholes. A common theme in the Mormon church, blame the victim. And it's interesting to note that church historian Richard E. Turley Jr. Nowadays basically says the opposite. They don't blame it on the victim anymore. They've realized how bad of an argument that is. This was in an article entitled The Mountain Meadows Massacre, Ensign Magazine, September 2007. One of the rare times that you'll ever find anything in a church magazine about Mountain Meadows. September 2007. Nothing that any of the immigrants or the Fancher party purportedly did or said, even if all of it were true, came close to justifying their deaths. So I totally agree with that statement. It's nice to hear the church saying this kind of stuff now. Nothing that any of them did or said, even if it was all true, came close to justifying their deaths. Even if they were having arguments and stuff, that's no death. That's no reason to go and wipe out 120 people, mostly women and children. Okay, another argument that Joseph Fielding Smith gives in the Essentials in Church History is that the Indians made the Mormons do it. You made me do it. Such a lame argument, but this is what it says. Later, other white men appeared upon the scene. Notice how he doesn't say they were Mormons, or he doesn't say who they are. Just random white men appeared upon the scene. Some of them remained willingly or by coercion of the Indians to participate in the massacre which followed. So he brings up the argument or the idea that maybe the white men that appeared upon the scene were coerced by the Indians to murder everybody. It doesn't make sense. How are the Indians going to coerce the Mormons to do this? It just doesn't make any sense. And again, nowadays, at least in 2007, in the same Ensign magazine, Turley says the opposite, which is nice to hear. Some traditional Utah histories, he doesn't say what they are, but, he's probably thinking about Essentials in Church History by Joseph Fielding. Some traditional Utah histories on the Mountain Meadows Massacre said that the Indians committed the atrocities on their own, or they forced fearful Latter-day Saint settlers to join them in the attack. They made them do it. Historical research shows that these stories are not accurate, so now they admit this. This is a cover of that Ensign article. If you look closely at the bottom, it says on the cover, Revisiting Mountain Meadows. The bottom part of the cover blown up even more. It's in a red box here that I put on here, Revisiting Mountain Meadows, page 14. All right, so back to a statement in Essentials in Church History. The white men who engaged in this horrible slaughter entered into a league by a strong and binding oath that they would never reveal the part they played in this gruesome tragedy. These random white men. Again, he doesn't say that they're Mormons. But we know that they were Mormons, so I put that in there in brackets. But he admits there was a cover-up. They went into a binding oath that they would never reveal what happened. He knows that they're Mormons. All right, another interesting statement here by Juanita Brooks. This is from her book, Mountain Meadows Massacre, 1950. She's pictured above in her younger days. Brooks concluded that to shrink from it, that is Mountain Meadows, to shrink from it, to discredit any who try to inquire into it, which happened to her, to refuse to discuss it, or to hesitate to accept all the evidence fearlessly, is not only to keep it a matter of controversy, but to make the most loyal followers doubt the veracity of their leaders in presenting other matters of history. And that's what it has done, and this video is going to show that. Okay, LDS leader Milton R. Hunter, pictured above. I think he was a 70. He was questioned about Brooks's book, but he argued that the church as a whole was free from blame for the massacre. Hunter, again pictured above, said that his mentor Herbert Bolton had advised him to stay away from subjects like the Mountain Meadows Massacre, as such small incidents were parts of history which should be forgotten. Small incident? Mass murder of 120 people, mostly women and children. Really strange what some of these church members say. All right, so this is from Levi Peterson's book, Juanita Brooks, Mormon Woman Historian, 1988, pictured above. Hunter could not understand why Brooks or anyone claiming to be a good Mormon would spend time digging into stuff like the Mountain Meadows Massacre when there are so many wonderful achievements that have taken place in Utah. So let's just not think about that mass murder. I don't want to think about it. Let's focus on the positive. Let's focus on the faith-promoting things. All of our wonderful achievements, and mass murdering 120 people. Let's just not think about that. All right, so also from the same book by Levi Peterson, Brooks long feared that the LDS Church would excommunicate her for the book, but a year after its publication, she told Charles Kelly that Mormon officials responded to her work by silence, total and absolute. So what was the response from the leaders of the Mormon Church to her book, which was a pretty accurate view of history? The church responded by silence, total and absolute. And pictured above is Levi Peterson. Is a cover of his autobiography. So Brooks continues, not a word anywhere. My local people, the bishop and the president of the stake, and all the authorities here never refer to the book. They evade it with the delicacy and solicitude they might show to a mother who has given birth to a monster child. So that's pretty interesting. And I got a picture of a monster child up here. That's how they looked at her book. They never talk about it. They evade it. And they treat it like it is a monster. All right. Brooks sent the Apostle Stephen L. Richards a copy of her book. He's pictured above. Richards said that he could not understand how a member with a record of devotion and service, such as you enjoy, should desire to recreate such a sad chapter in the history of southern Utah. Because it's a pretty important event. All right, and Bagley says regarding this, that Brooks said that the LDS historian's office still try to hold things out on me, but I have nailed them on so many things that I am not afraid of them anymore. So she had guts. She had balls. She was standing up to power, and I respect the hell out of her. Pictured above, it looks like Joseph Fielding Smith in his younger days. This looks like the LDS historian's office. That looks like Andrew Jensen. Not sure who the guy on the right is. Okay, so another account here in Bagley's book about J. Reuben Clark. He's pictured above. He's a member of the First Presidency. Successfully canceling the production of a movie based on Brooks's book. So Clark heard that Warner Brothers was interested in making a movie based on Brooks's book. He successfully lobbied his connections in the movie business to cancel the production. Notice that, successfully lobbied. So I'm not sure how the church had so much power in these earlier days to get these things canceled. You know, the article in the Saturday Evening Post, this movie by Warner Brothers. I would just think that they would go ahead and make them anyway, but somehow J. Reuben Clark had some connections to be able to get this movie canceled. And D. Michael Quinn, the excellent Mormon historian, in his book, The Mormon Hierarchy, Extensions of Power, 1997, he also talks about this movie getting canceled. In there, under November 5th, 1951, the first presidency learns of plans by Warner Brothers to make a film about the Mountain Meadows Massacre based on the recent scholarly book by LDS historian Juanita Brooks. I really wish this movie had gotten made. Maybe it'd be better than September Dawn. Anyway, within 7 days, the first presidency successfully persuades Hollywood studio to kill the project. All right, another example of this and getting projects killed is regarding Dale Morgan. The LDS Church's file on historian Dale Morgan, pictured above, reveals that J. Reuben Clark had previously undercut the Guggenheim Foundation's 1949 grant to support Morgan's projected multi-volume history of Mormonism. Somehow J. Reuben Clark undercut the Guggenheim Foundation to support Morgan's projected multi-volume history of Utah, or history of Mormonism. That would have been a really a nice history from a very good historian, but J. Reuben Clark got it canceled. All right, so what did the descendants of the Fancher party think of Brooks? Well, they think pretty highly of her. One of the descendants said that Brooks was the public voice, otherwise silent, of confession and contrition for the most shameful deed in Mormon history. So Brooks had to be the public voice, because up until this time, the 1950s, 1960s, the church was totally silent. All right, another example of this, of things getting canceled. The Deseret News refused to print Olive Burt's favorable review of Brooks's A Mormon Chronicle, The Diaries of John D. Lee. Burt called the paper a coward. I guess Burt works for the paper and called them a coward, the Deseret News. That takes some balls. So yeah, this Brooks got this published, A Mormon Chronicle, all of the diaries of John D. Lee. And also, Brooks was unable to gather support in Utah for a centennial commemoration of the massacre, a 100-year commemoration of the massacre. The church wasn't interested. They had no desire to have any ceremonies or have any speeches or to talk about anything. Okay, an interesting little tidbit here, kind of implicating Brigham Young in Bagley's book. Art Clark of Cedar City, a John D. Lee descendant, reports that his family has a John D. Lee journal account of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, maybe one that didn't get destroyed, or maybe a copy of it. It allegedly states that a cryptic message from Brigham Young arrived before the massacre. And what was the message? Brethren, do your duty. So, if that's true, that implicates Brigham Young in ordering it. And I might as well talk about it here, but like I said, Bagley believes that Brigham Young ordered it. I believe it too. I don't think too much of significance happened in Utah without Brigham Young being behind it or being responsible for it. He was basically a tyrant. He was the governor. He was the prophet. Whatever he said goes. Okay, so this story continues. John D. Lee descendants took the journal to LDS church headquarters in about 1957. Church officials returned it with instructions never to show it to anyone. That's pretty damning evidence. If it actually does exist and if they actually did see it. No one, Clark told archivist Janet Sigmiller, will ever see it. So Clark went along with that to hide it, and apparently they haven't shown it to anybody. Bet you Bagley would have liked to see that, the actual journal. And I guess pictured above is Janet Sigmiller. I think that's her. Okay, another statement by Bagley here. Brooks's fourth edition of her Mountain Meadows Massacre book, which came out in 1970, resolutely placed the blame where it belonged. White men, not the Indians, were chiefly responsible. Good. This conclusion was ignored by a new generation of Mormon historians, unfortunately. Those historians just plugged their ears and closed their eyes and pretended that these conclusions did not exist. All right, so what can you say about these Mormon historians? Well, this is a pretty good comment about them, I believe, by Upton Sinclair. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. I think that totally applies to all these BYU historians. They're under salary, their benefits, their retirement, all by the church, all of which they completely control. They can remove their temple recommends, and they can get them kicked out of BYU. Okay, Mormon historians often misrepresent Brooks's conclusions. They promote the notion that her analysis represents the last word on the subject, a claim that Brooks herself would certainly reject. Okay, also Kenneth Stamp has pointed out that church historian Leonard Arrington's most noted work, The Great Basin Kingdom, basically a history of the Latter-day Saints, from 1830 to 1900. So that's interesting that it started that early. 1830 to 1900, but certainly a history of the Great Basin Kingdom, Utah Territory, the Utah State. But the Great Basin Kingdom by Arrington fails to mention the massacre at all. So that just tells you how off limits it was. And Stamp also found that Arrington's account of the Mountain Meadows Massacre in the Mormon Experience, 1979, written with Davis Byton, he found the account in this book brief and vague. All right, a few statements here out of the book, The Mormon Experience. It says, the Mountain Meadows Massacre becomes historically understandable, if not pardonable, when viewed as the result of a combination of Mormon hysteria during the early stages of the Utah War. So, and we'll continue with this statement on the next slide. But that is pretty crazy that in this book, they're saying maybe this crime was pardonable because of certain extenuating circumstances. A pardon is, so look at this card above, a pardon. This card may be used until needed or sold to get out of crimes free. We should just pardon the Mormons. They would never, ever say that nowadays. Utah War. Nobody died in the Utah War. We haven't really covered this. It wasn't really a war. Nobody died. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, the rumors that this company, the Fancher Party, was a military observation party in advance of the main federal army, and the misbehavior of some members of the Fancher train, mainly a few hangers-on known as the Missouri Wildcats. All right, were these Mormon leaders in southern Utah really that stupid that they thought that this immigration train trying to go to California was really a military observation party for the federal army? They were really that stupid? They couldn't tell the difference? I think that's just BS. And the misbehavior of some of the members of the Fancher train, mainly a few hangers-on known as the Missouri Wildcats. Well, some other historians actually did the work in the U.S. Census data to determine who this Fancher wagon train, or who they were. And when they looked at the census data, they were all from Arkansas. Not one single person in the train was from Missouri. So if Arrington and Byton would have done their homework and their research, they would know that. And I have covered that on another slide. All right, so these Missouri Wildcats forcibly expropriated supplies, I guess, from the Mormons. There's no evidence of that. And made profane, provocative boasts that they had participated in the Haun's Mill Massacre. Well, Haun's Mill Massacre was in Missouri. None of these people were from Missouri. So you can't make that argument. And other mob actions against the Saints, which they don't talk about. And then Bagley talks about Arrington's book, Brigham Young, American Moses, which was a much praised biography of Brigham Young. It commended Brooks's study as complete and dependable, but it ignored her most significant conclusions. And Melvin T. Smith also agrees with Bagley. He did a review of American Moses in Dialogue, 1987. The Mountain Meadows Massacre, blood, atonement, etc. receive inadequate treatment in Arrington's American Moses. Yes, indeed. That's another very taboo topic, blood atonement. Of course, pictured above is Arrington. John G. Turner points this out. He is a professor at George Mason University and a Mormon historian. He wrote the book, Brigham Young, Pioneer Prophet, one of the better biographies about Brigham. He says, American Moses spends very little time on controversial but central topics such as polygamy and the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And that's not by accident. Arrington knew he could get in trouble, so he didn't spend much time on polygamy and Mountain Meadows Massacre in American Moses. So back to Bagley. So who did Arrington blame for the massacre? Well, this is pretty interesting. If this is such a great biography, how did he get this so wrong? Well, because for any taboo subjects, Arrington went from being a historian to an apologist. That's just what he did with taboo subjects, and it's what he kind of had to do because the leaders of the church made him do that. In American Moses, Arrington laid the blame for the massacre on the Indians and the immigrants themselves. Blame the victim. Blame the immigrants, blame the victim, and blame it on the Indians. And Bagley continues about Arrington. Arrington and his colleagues had complete access to the Brigham Young papers, but they ignored and sometimes distorted evidence at their fingertips. So, and pictured above is a picture of distortion. Dennis Lithgow also talks about this in the Deseret News 2002. It is true that Leonard Arrington paid little attention to the Mountain Meadows Massacre in his book. Hear nothing, see nothing, say nothing. All right, so one good thing in American Moses, though, is that Arrington does admit in American Moses that Brigham Young and George A. Smith deliberately suppressed the facts of the tragedy to protect the church. So Arrington does admit that there was a cover-up. All right, another statement from Bagley. After Brigham Young's death, the men in the church historian's office carefully released records that would absolve their prophet of any guilt and lay the blame on the Indians and the local authorities. And I think this is the church historian's office in the early days. Maybe that's just a general picture of an office. Okay, a statement here by historian Gene Sessions. He's a PhD professor at Weber State University in Utah. This is from the Burying the Past DVD, a DVD about Mountain Meadows Massacre. It came out 2003. It's pretty accurate representation of Mountain Meadows. Anyway, Gene Sessions says the cover-up question regarding the church, and Brigham Young particularly, is without question. There's no debate on that there was a cover-up. Young determined to cover this up. This would be a disaster for the church. And this video here that I'm making is documenting that disaster. All right, another journal that was suppressed was Dimmick Huntington's journal. This according to Bagley as well. When necessary, Mormon historians suppressed evidence that implicated Brigham Young, such as the Dimmick Huntington Journal. Dimmick is pictured above. All right, pretty honest statement by the Mormon Glenn Leonard. He's a PhD, former BYU University professor. He's one of the authors of the Mormon's book on the Mountain Meadows called Massacre at Mountain Meadows, along with Turley and Walker. But this was before that book came out, and this was a moment of honesty, believe it or not. You can find this on the Burying the Past DVD as well. Leonard says, those who don't trust the church have good reason. Because he's had to deal with the descendants in Arkansas of the victims of Mountain Meadows. So those who don't trust the church have good reason, because in the past, that story about Mountain Meadows Massacre has not been told openly by church members or by church historians. Very good, Leonard. A moment of honesty in 2003. The story of Mountain Meadows has not been told openly by church historians, and this video documents that fact in spades. It has been very difficult to acknowledge the truth because the truth hurts. And of course, Leonard is pictured above. Official church histories assigned the responsibility to one man, and that was John D. Lee. That's what Joseph Fielding Smith did and others. And denounced him as a monster who deified God's will. What about all the other Mormons that participated? And another statement by Bagley. The cover-up of Young's involvement was a remarkably successful endeavor, for it is hard to find a modern history that fails to absolve the Mormon leader, Brigham Young, of any responsibility for the massacre. And this is a relatively recent picture here of Brigham Young. I believe it's on BYU campus. He got poured on paint on the statue, and is you can see where it says racist in paint. This is with the Black Lives Matter movement that's gone crazy here in July of 2020. All right, another account here of a film and miniseries that got canceled. This according to Bagley again. CBS planned to make a film or miniseries about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. The Church Historical Department staff wrote letters outlining the problems that the network would face in dealing with the massacre as a historical event. Church officials apparently called on influential members to exert additional pressure. Although the script was completed and filming was scheduled, producer David Susskind and CBS abandoned the project. So it's amazing how much power the church has to get these projects canceled. Pictured above is David Susskind. Eventually, there would be a movie made, September Dawn. I think I have a few slides on that. All right, another statement by Bagley. Prestigious Mormon scholars like Ronald K. Esplin, he's on the left, and Dean C. Jesse on the right, two prominent BYU professors, blame the massacre on vicious Paiutes well into the 1990s. All right, Bagley also talks about Utah, the Right Place, book written by Thomas G. Alexander, Mormon historian. In it, it is claimed that the Fancher party abused the Paiutes, quote unquote, and that the tribe dogged the wagon train all the way from Fillmore down to Cedar City. So it claims that the Fancher party abused the Indians and that the tribe dogged the wagon train from Fillmore. So these ideas are now disavowed by Turley and others. All right, so in this book by Alexander, Utah, the Right Place, they presented the theory that the Indians made the Mormons do it. So that's also dishonest history. They made the Mormons do it. Okay, so Anne Eliza Young, wife number 19 book, came out in 1875. She was the 19th wife of Brigham Young. Has a very interesting account about the cover-up regarding Mountain Meadows Massacre. So she says, I felt the mystery that shrouded the whole horrible transaction, and I knew instinctively, as did many others, that something was being hidden from the mass of the people by their leaders, which it was not deemed prudent to reveal, and it was the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And of course, Anne Eliza Young is pictured above. Okay, so Anne Eliza Young continues. All wonder concerning this wholesale murder was speedily hushed up. Any definite mention of it was avoided by the leaders of the church. When it was spoken of at all, it was with a cautious manner, apprehensive glances, and in whispered tones under the breath. Okay, so Anne continues. Priests and people alike hesitated to approach the dreaded subject of Mountain Meadows, and there was an almost superhuman endeavor on the part of the church authorities to erase all remembrance of it from the minds of their followers. And Anne continues, I followed the example of my elders and never spoke of the subject, Mountain Meadows. Even to my mother, it haunted me perpetually. The people were so quiet, since there was a tacit understanding that they must be so. So successful has been the quiet policy of the Mormon leaders that I find the extent of its horrors but dimly understood east of the Rocky Mountains. All right, we're going to go through a number of history books on Mormonism, mostly written by Mormons. Starting here in 1893, and we're going to go in pretty much chronological order and document what all these different history books, mostly written by Mormons, say about Mountain Meadows, if anything. So the first one here is from Mormon writer Edward H. Anderson. He wrote the 184-page book, The Life of Brigham Young in 1893. Pictured above, you can see on there it says Life of Brigham Young. Mountain Meadows Massacre is not mentioned anywhere in this book. Okay, an account here by Anthon H. Lund out of his diaries. His diaries came out in 2006 by Signature Books. This is an entry on February 21st, 1902. He says, I read the sketch given by Brother Orson F. Whitney of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It was a horrible affair, but the Indians were the perpetrators, egged on by some very mean men, Philip Klingensmith and John D. Lee. So he's just given an account of what Orson F. Whitney said about Mountain Meadows. which was basically that the Indians were the perpetrators, egged on by some mean men like Philip Klingensmith and John D. Lee. I believe Anton H. Lund is pictured above, if I remember this picture correctly. All right, an account here from the Apostle Anthony W. Ivins in his diaries, came out in 2013. He says John D. Lee was principally responsible for the killing of the party of immigrants who were massacred here. So he's basically using Lee as a scapegoat. And of course, the Apostle Anthony W. Ivins is pictured above. All right, so let's get to some more books. We're actually going to go through some of the textbooks used in early Utah schools. Now, I got this information from Casey W. Olson's PhD dissertation, which I mentioned before. An excellent resource for this video. Couldn't be happier about finding that dissertation. And I'd recommend everybody go read his dissertation. It's online. He says Levi E. Young, a president of the 70 in the Mormon Church, wrote an early history for Utah schools, which was entitled Chief Episodes in the History of Utah. Came out in 1912. So the leaders of the church pretty much controlled the state and the state schools, and even a lot of the textbooks that they used were written by Mormons, and this went on even up until like the 1970s, as we'll show in this video. But so we have Levi E. Young's book here. Young is pictured above. His book is Chief Episodes in the History of Utah, 1912. But the Mountain Meadows Massacre is never mentioned in this history book of Utah. All right, let's go to the prophet Joseph F. Smith's book, Gospel Doctrine. Came out in 1919. He gave a brief mention to Mountain Meadows. Of course, Smith is pictured above. It must be said that the feelings against the Mormons were on account of the exaggerated reports of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Well, how were the reports exaggerated? Mormons really didn't participate? Only a few Mormons? He basically says the accounts of Mountain Meadows Massacre were exaggerated. And I would say the opposite. If anything, they were downplayed, and Mormon involvement not mentioned. Okay, another book mentioned by Olson. Again, it's by Levi E. Young. He wrote an early history of Utah entitled The Founding of Utah, which came out in 1923. Again, Levi is pictured above. This book was for an American audience, so it wasn't a Utah textbook. In this book, Levi presents the Paiute Indians as primarily responsible for the massacre, with some local white Mormons assisting. So that should really be turned around. The white Mormons are primarily responsible, so that should be, just reversed. Okay, the Mormon writer Preston Nibley, pictured above, he wrote the 552-page book on Brigham Young. It's entitled Brigham Young, the Man and His Work. It's pictured above here on the right. Came out in 1925, a pretty long book. However, Nibley never mentions the Mountain Meadows Massacre. All right, so what about the Apostle James E. Talmage, the prolific writer of many, many books on history and doctrine of the Mormon Church? He lived from 1862 to 1933. Talmage is pictured above, more in his younger years. But there is no mention of the Mountain Meadows Massacre in any of Apostle Talmage's books. Crazy. I'm able to search through all of his books, not all of them, but I would say all of his significant books, 5, 6, 7 of his significant books. He never mentions it. Interesting, huh? Okay, the book entitled The Life Story of Brigham Young, 1930 388 pages, written by the plural wife of Brigham Young, Susa Young Gates, and also the wife of Apostle John A. Widstow, Leah D. Widstow. In a chapter entitled The Indians, they call the Mountain Meadows Massacre a most revolting Indian tragedy. Nothing to do with Mormons. A most revolting Indian tragedy, and it's in a chapter entitled The Indians. And of course, the book is pictured above. Okay, from the same book here, they say the Mountain Meadows Massacre tragedy happened while Indian depredations were at their height. So they're basically just saying it's another Indian depredation. And of course, Susa Young Gates, plural wife of Brigham Young, is pictured above. All right, so Gates and Widstow are going to pin some of the blame on John D. Lee, the scapegoat, even though they don't mention him by name. Pictured above is the Apostle John A. Widstow, and his wife is on the right, Leah D. Widstow, one of the authors of this book. So in the book it says, the Indians then sent runners throughout the surrounding country, calling for reinforcements from among their tribes, and for a member of the Mormon church who had been in close touch with Indian affairs as their farmer, to come and lead them to victory. So it was basically an Indian attack. They weren't able to finish them off, so then the Indians went out and tried to find a member of the Mormon church who could lead them to victory. And of course, we know from other slides that's John D. Lee they're talking about here. And they're just saying, basically putting it all on him. But they do say that later other white men appeared upon the scene. Other white men appeared upon the scene. Now, notice they are not named. Even John D. Lee is not named. But these other white men are not named, nor do they mention that they were even Mormon. So, yeah, some other people just appeared upon the scene. And then they say some of them, the white men, remained willingly or by coercion to participate in the massacre. So, these other white men that just show up, doesn't say who they are, doesn't say that they're Mormon. And then they present the idea that maybe they were coerced by the Indians to participate in the massacre. So in other words, the Indians made them do it. It was coercion, as pictured above. They basically had a gun to their heads. And then they say Brigham Young and the church were entirely blameless in the matter. Of course, Brigham Young entirely blameless, the church entirely blameless, even though we got several stake presidents, bishop. And in my mind, they probably did receive orders from George A. Smith and from George A. Smith back up to Brigham Young. All right, so then they put this in their book. They quote from Bancroft's History of Utah. He's pictured above, Bancroft, stating that this horrible crime was the crime of an individual, one individual, the crime of a fanatic of the worst type, one who was a member of the Mormon church, but of whose intentions the church knew nothing. So even Bancroft's History of the Church was covering this up. They must have got some influence from the leaders of the church. But I do believe Bancroft put more of the truth into his footnotes. Anyway, so these writers of this book thus blamed John D. Lee without naming him, as we've already mentioned. And then they say the church and its leaders were cleared of any suspected participation therein. Not true. Many of those that participated were on the run. I think Dame, I think Haight, I think Hamblin, I think Lee, they were all on the run from the law during certain times. All right, so we come to another Utah school textbook. This one is written by the Mormon educator and writer John H. Evans. The title is The Story of Utah, the Beehive State, 1933, a Utah school textbook. And they say in there that it is certain, of course, that there were Mormons in the group of persons who committed the deed at Mountain Meadows, but they were acting in their own individual capacity, not by reason of any order, expressed or implicit, from any church man. That is total hogwash. Orders came down from Dame, Haight, and from Lee. So that is complete hogwash. All right, so we go to the church historian Andrew Jensen in his encyclopedic history of the church. Encyclopedic information in here, 1941, 552 pages, barely mentions Mountain Meadows. But what it says is that the Fancher party were murdered by Indians, assisted by a few whites. That was kind of the running narrative for a long time. Murdered basically primarily by Indians, assisted by a few whites. Now, what is a few? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Well, now the church admits that it's 50 to 60 Mormon men participated. All right, let's go to another Utah school textbook. This one written by Milton R. Hunter, a general authority in the Quorum of the 70. Why are these guys writing the textbooks for Utah schools? For both Mormons and non-Mormons. The non-Mormons are getting the views and the twist and the spin from the Mormon leaders in their school textbooks. And this is now in 1943. The textbook is entitled Utah in Her Western Setting, Deseret News Press. The book dedicates only one sentence of its 614 pages to the topic of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So easy to list here, the one sentence. And it says, some white men assisted the Indians in the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which took place in the fall of 1857. Some white men assisted the Indians, so that's kind of their running narrative at this point. The Indians are basically to blame, with a few white men assisting. Notice how they don't say that the white men are Mormons here in this. And pictured above, we have the cover of Utah in Her Western Setting. All right, so Casey W. Olson also makes this point. Milton's textbook, and Milton is pictured above again, Milton's textbook served to distance the LDS Church, its leaders, and the larger Mormon community from the atrocity of Mountain Meadows. Indeed, the white men who assisted the Indians are not identified as Mormons. All right, so Olson continues here. Milton's book clearly downplayed the significance of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It characterized the atrocity as one of a relatively few Indian uprisings in Utah. So it's basically just an Indian uprising that resulted in comparatively little loss of life and property. Little loss of life and property. He's not mentioning the 120 that were killed, mostly women and children. I would definitely not say the 120 is a little loss of life. That is a large mass murder. Okay, so the Apostle Joseph Fielding Smith's seminal work, Doctrines of Salvation, came out in 1954, 55, and 56 in 3 volumes containing 1,086 pages on nearly every church topic, but it completely omits any reference to Mountain Meadows Massacre. Bizarre. Almost every church topic in doctrine and history, but it completely omits any reference to Mountain Meadows. We've gone over his other book, Essentials in Church History, where he does briefly cover it in there in an apologetic and untruthful way. Okay, another book that Olson mentions is from the Mormon writer Carter E. Grant. He wrote the book The Kingdom of God Restored, 1955. It was a book for LDS seminary students. The book presents Paiute Indians as primarily responsible for the massacre, with some local white Mormons assisting. That should just basically be reversed. Okay, Apostle Joseph Fielding Smith's seminal work, Answers to Gospel Questions, 1957, in 5 volumes. Not sure how many pages, but it's a lot. It contains answers to nearly every church question, but it as well completely omits any reference to Mountain Meadows Massacre. All right, the writer Thomas F. O'Dea, I think he was a sociologist. He wrote the book The Mormons, 1957. It's considered a pretty good work of history and sociology on the Mormons. He says there was suppression of information and obstruction of prosecution for over a decade regarding Mountain Meadows by the Mormon Church. Mormon leaders were afraid to speak frankly about it, hoping to smother Gentile interest and Mormon concern with silence. And of course, O'Dea is pictured above. All right, so what about Bruce R. McConkie, the seminal church scholar? His most well-known book is Mormon Doctrine. First came out in 1958. First edition is a lot different than the editions that came after it, but it contains 856 pages on nearly every church topic. However, it completely omits any reference to the Mountain Meadows Massacre. That is not an accident. Okay, also, none of Apostle Bruce R. McConkie's other books and speeches mention the Mountain Meadows Massacre either. You can search through sermons and writings of Bruce R. McConkie, Bruce R. McConkie's story, his doctrinal, is that how you say that? Doctrinal New Testament commentary in 3 large volumes, and a new witness for the Articles of Faith. No mention of Mountain Meadows Massacre in any of these. You can also search through Bruce R. McConkie's The Messiah series, 6 volumes. The Mortal Messiah, 4 volumes. The Promised Messiah, The Millennial Messiah, all very large volumes. Never mentions Mountain Meadows Massacre once. I also have another book called Bruce R. McConkie Highlights from His Life and Teachings by Dennis B. Horn. Never mentions Mountain Meadows Massacre in there. You can search churchofjesuschrist.org through all of his speeches. Never mentions Mountain Meadows Massacre there. You can search his BYU speeches online. Same there. All right, this is a little bit off topic. It's a letter from the Apostle Bruce R. McConkie to BYU professor Eugene England, 1981, telling him to remain silent about certain topics, Adam, God, whether or not God can progress, etc., or whether or not God is the same God eternally, forever and ever. I guess it does relate because he is telling him to remain silent. And even Bruce R. McConkie was too scared to bring up the topic of Mountain Meadows. But this is what it said in the letter. It is my province to teach to the church what the doctrine is. It is your province to echo what I say, like a little parrot, like a little clone, echo what I say, or to remain silent. This is what he's saying to the liberal BYU professor, Eugene England, of course. Bruce R. McConkie, very conservative and orthodox. England pictured above here. All right, so we have another Utah school textbook that came out in 1960 and went through a few editions, pictured above. It's called The Utah Story. And again, it was written by Milton R. Hunter, general authority in the Quorum of the 70. He wrote this popular textbook. The book contained no reference or allusion to the Mountain Meadows Massacre at all in 436 pages of text. Mountain Meadows, not a big enough, good enough story to make it into the Utah Story textbook. Again, the source on this is Olson in his dissertation at Utah State University. And here you can see this section of the cover blown up. The Utah Story by Milton R. Hunter. Okay, next we have the popular church book, The Restored Church, by William E. Barrett, CES teacher, 1961. The Fancher Party contained a group of Missourians who styled themselves the Missouri Wildcats. They boasted openly of having helped to oust the Mormons from Missouri and Illinois, that they were going to return and help the army which was approaching Utah to exterminate the saints. Well, people have looked into census data. A Mormon historian, I think his name was Coates, has looked into that, and according to census data for the Arkansas party, the Fancher Party, there was no Missourians in their group. None. This whole idea of the Missouri Wildcats, these ruffians that pushed the Mormons out of Missouri and Illinois, is not true. Okay, let's get to Juanita Brooks's book here, The Mountain Meadows Massacre, 1962. Now we're in the chronology. 1962. In the book, on page 216, she says, a number of reputable Mormon scholars have begun research on the topic of Mountain Meadows, only to be turned away from it for one reason or another. Two of these men have said that they discontinued because they were counseled, quote unquote, with such vigor to leave it alone that they felt sure that to continue would cost them not only their positions in church schools, BYU, but their membership in the church itself. So that's very interesting. And a lot of this kind of pressure came down on Brooks as well, which we will get to. All right, so what did BYU professor / apologist Hugh Nibley have to say about Mountain Meadows? Well, not very much. Not much at all. The only place I could find him mentioning it was in a small book entitled Sounding Brass, Informal Studies in the Lucrative Art of Telling Stories about Brigham Young and the Mormons. 1963, we're now in the chronology. Really? Lucrative? Lucrative art of telling stories about Brigham Young. Not sure how much they were making at the time. You know, people like Anne Eliza Young and Wild Bill Hickman. Maybe they made more back in those days. Anyway, he says, Nibley calls the Mountain Meadows Massacre another Indian massacre in the worst year of Indian depredations. That's all he says. That's just another Indian massacre in the worst year of Indian depredations. And he's kind of saying these things in passing. He's not really going into a full apologetic here on Mountain Meadows. And of course, Nibley is pictured above. Middle-aged Nibley, not too old yet. Okay, so from the same book here, you can see the cover, Sounding Brass. Nibley also calls the Mountain Meadows Massacre a 3-day Indian battle. Man, the apologist, Nibley, McConkie, really staying away from this topic, and Nibley here telling some lies. Okay, so what about the other 18 volumes of the collected works of Hugh Nibley? Sounding Brass is in one of those volumes, I think mixed in with a couple other books in that one volume, but there's 18 other volumes. Does he ever really address Mountain Meadows? Well, as I put here, as the main apologetic scholar for the LDS Church during the 1950s to the 1980s, and even a little beyond that, Hugh Nibley never deals with the topic of Mountain Meadows Massacre other than a few brief mentions in Sounding Brass, 1963, which we've already gone over. There is no mention of Mountain Meadows Massacre in the other 18 volumes of the collected works of Hugh Nibley, which is a ton, a ton of pages, and a ton of volumes here, as pictured above. Still sold by Deseret Book. All the footnotes cleaned up now by BYU professors. Okay, another book used as a Utah school textbook, written by the Mormon writer Fay J. Buddle, or Butel. Utah Grows, Past and Present, 1970. So notice, all the way up here till 1970, Mormons are still writing the history books for Utah. Not fair. It says in there, hundreds of Indians arrived and demanded that John D. Lee and the other Mormons help them slaughter the Fancher party, or the Indians would kill him. You either help John D. Lee or we will kill you. The Indians made John D. Lee do it and turn against the Mormons and help the U.S. Army in its expedition into Utah. The Mormons either allowed or were not successful in preventing the Indians from also killing the women and children. So Indians made John D. Lee and other Mormons do it. They don't really say how many. Mormons maybe wanted to prevent the attacks, but they couldn't, or the Indians would kill them. And then they blame the killing of the women and children on the Indians. And you're going to see that even up into some pretty recent sources, that the Mormon apologists are still blaming the Indians for killing all the women and children, which was the majority of the Fancher party. It is not true. Non-Mormon historians do not agree with that. Bagley doesn't agree with that. And a lot of the Mormons were dressed up as Indians. So it would be hard to tell. But the majority of the slaughter was women and children, and they all ran for their lives. So in my mind, anybody that could chase them down and kill them would do it, whether Indian or Mormon. All right, so Olson gives us a little more commentary about this book, Utah Grows, Past and Present, 1970. Accompanying this narrative is an image in the book of the massacre. The image is entitled Mountain Meadows Massacre, September 11, 1857. The image shows immigrants being attacked and killed by 7 Indians with tomahawks and spears, and 4 white men with rifles or clubs. So, kind of blaming the Indians more than the white men. All right, Olson continues. Indians are the dominant aggressors in the image. Butel portrayed Indians as the primary aggressors who later forced John D. Lee and other Mormons to participate in subsequent attacks. The narrative is clear in asserting that the Indians were principally to blame for the massacre. Okay, a history here by BYU professor Russell R. Rich. Ensign to the Nations, A History of the LDS Church from 1846 to 1972. Quite a lot of history there. It's a BYU publication in 1972. Cover pictured above. Rich's book places most of the blame for the atrocity on the Fancher Company itself. Blame the victims. Most of the blame on the Fancher Party themselves, and names the Indians as the primary murderers. All right, let's go to Leonard J. Arrington's diaries. These are very good sources now that have come out not too long ago, like a year or two ago. An entry, December 1st, 1973. One of the covers is pictured above. I'm not sure which. I guess that's volume 2. It's 3 volumes of his diaries. Anyway, for this entry in 1973, there are 3 topics which the church magazines studiously avoid. Magazines like The Children's Friend, The Ensign, The Improvement Era. What are the 3 topics that church magazines avoid? Polygamy, Masonry, Mountain Meadows Massacre, Negroes and the priesthood, and practices connected with the temple. So that's pretty interesting. An inside scoop in Arrington's diary. Church magazines studiously avoid any mention of Mountain Meadows Massacre. And here's a more close-up view of part of the cover. Confessions of a Mormon Historian, The Diaries of Leonard J. Arrington, 1971 to 1997. This one's volume 2. It's in 3 volumes. All right, so another interesting comment here by Arrington in his diaries. Arrington is pictured above. He says, "There are persons who tell me that it is impossible for a Mormon, let alone a church employee like Arrington, to write a reasonably objective and complete history. It's impossible." There are persons who tell him, and that was pretty much true, especially if it was about something controversial like Mountain Meadows. Impossible for a Mormon, let alone a church employee, like a BYU professor, to write a reasonably objective and complete history. So Arrington continues, to write this type of a history, it must be done by a non-Mormon, like Bagley. Arrington is telling us right here, guys. It's got to be done by a non-Mormon, like Bagley. That's still true today. Because he has neither internal nor external restraints on what he writes. The church doesn't control him. And in this period of his diaries, it's in the 1970s, the early part of the 1970s. Got to be done by a non-Mormon, but I think this still applies today, and when Bagley wrote his book, and when the 3 Mormons wrote their book on Mountain Meadows. There's still problems with it. Some of the main ones not dealing with blood atonement issues, blaming the Indians on killing the women and children, etc. Okay, so what did the Apostle Joseph Fielding Smith think of Juanita Brooks and her book? Well, Arrington tells us in his diaries. Good stuff here, good stuff. Entry on August 27, 1976. Apostle David B. Haight told the following story. As Apostle Joseph Fielding Smith walked into my home, that's Haight's home, where I entertained him, he was carrying a copy of the Mountain Meadows Massacre by Juanita Brooks, which had recently come out. So this is a story that goes back to like 1950, 51, 52, somewhere in there. I mentioned the book to him. I see that you have Juanita Brooks's book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Joseph Fielding replied, "She is an evil woman." So that's what Joseph Fielding Smith thought of Juanita. Being maybe tempted and controlled by Satan. She is an evil woman for writing this truthful book on the Mountain Meadows, for writing a true history. And of course, pictured above, we have a woman with looking kind of evil with evil eyes. Okay, another interesting story in Arrington's diaries. Now we're in 1975 to 1980. An entry on September 7, 1976. It's regarding Apostle Delbert L. Stapley, pictured above. Stapley said that some members of the Quorum of the 12 felt very strongly that we should not put anything into our histories that reflects badly on the church. Well, that would certainly be Juanita Brooks's book, right? Okay, we now get to 1976. The Mormon authors James B. Allen and Glenn M. Leonard wrote the book The Story of the Latter-day Saints. And you'll recognize Glenn Leonard here is also writing the Mormons' version of events in that Massacre at Mountain Meadows book. But in here, back in 1976, they said an angry band of Indians and a few overzealous settlers murdered a company of immigrants on their way to California. A few overzealous settlers. Well, were they Mormon settlers? Doesn't say. Though the church itself cannot be held responsible, the Mountain Meadows Massacre is nevertheless the most tragic slur, kind of like a defamation, the most tragic slur on its history. An angry band of Indians and a few overzealous settlers. Well, back in these days, they're talking about one person, John D. Lee, or a handful of people, not the 50 or 60 people they talk about nowadays. Okay, another statement here from the same book. John D. Lee was unsuccessful in his efforts to calm the Indians and felt threatened himself if they were stopped from raiding the wagon train. The Indians made John D. Lee and whatever other white people that are not mentioned here, whatever other white Mormons, the Indians made them do it. They felt threatened by the Indians. All right, a brief statement here by the Tanners, Gerald and Sandra Tanner. Mormonism, Shadow or Reality, 1987, 5th edition, pictured above. Obviously, the Mormon church leaders are trying to cover up the truth about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. The Mormon church does not want to take any responsibility for this crime. All right, so D. Michael Quinn talks about a letter from George Albert Smith on August 17, 1858. It says, the Apostle George Albert Smith participated in a conspiracy to obstruct justice by misrepresenting Mountain Meadows Massacre. All right, D. Michael Quinn, again here, same book, Origins of Power. The prophet Brigham Young committed misprision of a felony from 1857 to 1877, 20 years, in not reporting to the judicial authorities the knowledge that he received from his adoptive son, John D. Lee, about Mormon participation in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So what is misprision? It is the deliberate concealment of one's knowledge of a treasonable act or a felony. Deliberate concealment of one's knowledge. Quinn is saying that's what Brigham Young did for 20 years. Okay, we're up to 1996, and this is a statement made in 1996 by the Mormon writer Susan Evans McLeod. She wrote a book called Brigham Young, An Inspiring Personal Biography. McLeod is pictured above, I do believe, if I got her picture right. She says the Mountain Meadows Massacre was blown out of proportion. That's what Joseph F. Smith said way back in the early 1900s. It was exaggerated. So she says the Mountain Meadows Massacre was blown out of proportion. Really? Okay, back to D. Michael Quinn. We're now in the Extensions of Power book, 1997. Despite their well-earned reputation for keeping detailed records of community life and personal experiences, Mormon diarists rarely wrote about these events and perpetrators of Mormon murders. They didn't like to put things in their diaries about Mormon murders or, you could say, Mountain Meadows Massacre. And pictured above is a picture of a Mormon execution by blood atonement. Yeah, it's probably found in some old anti-Mormon book. I used to believe that nobody was killed because of blood atonement. I do not believe that anymore. I think it happened more often than you would think. All right, another statement here by Quinn in Extensions of Power book. That silence engulfed the diaries of the entire southern Utah community involved in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Well, if you listen to Bagley, yeah, there was probably some self-censorship going on, but there was also a lot of just basic censorship and cutting out pages of diaries and totally doing a whitewash of history as well. All right, here's an interesting statement by Quinn, Extensions of Power again. Brigham Young later tells participants that he approves of the massacre, wow, and lets them know that he expects them to exonerate each other in a court of law. So that goes against what Gordon B. Hinckley said. I believe it was the 1999 dedication of a monument at Mountain Meadows, where he said Brigham Young did not condone what happened. He was against it. He didn't order it. He was against it. Well, that's not what Quinn says. Brigham Young later tells participants that he approves of the massacre and lets them know that he expects them to exonerate each other in a court of law. All right, Quinn continues. Brigham Young publicly intimidates anyone who is inclined to give evidence against Mormon participants in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Wow, publicly intimidates anyone who is inclined to give evidence against Mormon participants. Okay, Quinn continues. Extensions of power. Brigham Young refuses to give federal authorities information, that's a cover-up, that would implicate nearly all the adults of small Mormon community in the massacre and a division of victims' property. All right, Quinn continues here. Then, when total denial becomes impossible, Brigham Young scapegoats 3 men through excommunication and arranges for participants to testify against and jurymen to convict only John D. Lee, Brigham Young's adopted son, and Council of 50 member. So interesting. Young scapegoats 3 men through excommunication and arranges for participants to testify against John D. Lee. Okay, another statement here by Quinn, same book, August 17, 1858. What, maybe a year after the massacre? The Apostle George A. Smith denies Mormon participation in the Mountain Meadows Massacre and begins a conspiracy to obstruct justice. All right, from Richard and Joan Osling's book, The Mormon America, or Mormon America, 1999, excellent book. Brooks's research implicated the church in attempting to cover up the role played by Mormons in the slaughter at Mountain Meadows. All right, same source here. The church history course, Religion 341 to 343, tends to sidestep sensitive historical matters that might reflect badly on the church or raise delicate questions. All right, so I think I got the cover here for this history course, Church History in the Fullness of Times. It devotes 4 pages to the Haun's Mill Massacre of 1838, in which 17 Missouri Mormons were mercilessly slaughtered. By contrast, the Mountain Meadows Massacre of 1857, described in only 2 pages, is not indexed in the history textbook. So yeah, that's an interesting point. The Mormons like to talk about Haun's Mill Massacre all day long, and they devoted 4 pages to that in this book. Only 2 pages to Mountain Meadows. I'm surprised they even put that much, but nothing in the index about Mountain Meadows. All right, so the Ostlings continue here. The textbook that we showed on the previous slide, or course, tiptoes around the full disclosure of Mormon involvement in the tragedy. And then I found this student manual, the Church History in the Fullness of Times, Religion 341-343, 2003 edition. local Mormons killed the men while the Indians slew the women and older children. So this is what I was talking about before. In these church sources, now we're all the way up to 2003, they blame the Indians on killing the women and the children, or the women and the older children. All right, so again, church historian Richard E. Turley Jr. says the same thing in the Ensign. This article that came out in September 2007, of course, Turley is pictured above. He says, at a prearranged signal, each militiaman turned and shot the immigrant next to him, while the Indians rushed from their hiding place to attack the terrified women and children. So, this is still apologetical stuff. They are blaming the Indians, not for the entire massacre anymore, but they're still blaming the Indians for killing the women and children. And like I said, according to other non-Mormon historians and Bagley, this is not the way it went down. Mormon historian Glenn Leonard, pictured above here, says the same thing. You can tell this is a talking point, and you can tell that this is in the correlated version of history that the church puts out. This is 2008. They did a video on C-SPAN. It was held at Ken Sanders' Mormon book store. So Leonard says, the Mormon men shot the men, and that was the signal for the Paiute Indians to rush from their hiding place and kill the women and children. So they're blaming that on the Indians. Like I said, the majority of this Fancher party were women and children. So you're still basically blaming the Indians for most of the death, most of the damage. They don't want to admit that any Mormon man in southern Utah would kill a woman or a child, but that's what has happened, and they're still doing apologetics on this. And this even goes back in history, back to 1980. The liberal Mormon writer Eugene England, he even did apologetics about this kind of stuff. In his book entitled Brother Brigham, 1980, 50 Iron County militiamen slaughtered the men, and 200 Indians killed the women and older children. So this has been a part of correlated history. All right, that Church History in the Fullness of Times student manual, they say commitments were made to blame the massacre entirely upon the Indians. We've gone over that a lot. Okay, let's go to Richard Baines, pictured above. His book is One Nation Under Gods, Plurality of Gods, 2002. In the weeks and months following the massacre, Brigham Young and his inner circle hid the culpability behind a veil of recriminations and cover-ups. All right, from the same source here, Mormon participants in the Mountain Meadows Massacre were sworn to never tell the Gentiles what had happened. Moreover, the LDS church leadership blamed the Indians entirely, and investigations made by federal agents were frustrated. All right, another statement here by Baines. The denials, the lies, and legal obstructions would continue for 20 years. Finally, after intense pressure from the government and surviving members of the slain immigrants, the LDS Church picked a scapegoat. That scapegoat was John D. Lee, pictured above in his coffin after he was executed. Okay, let's go to Gregory Prince and William Robert Wright's book, David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism, 2005. In regards to Juanita Brooks's book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre, Prince and Wright say that there were efforts to block its publication. That's Brooks's book. And Brooks was ostracized both locally and at church headquarters. That's true. She did not hold any prominent church position after its publication. And she did have prominent church positions before that. Her family was also ostracized. All right, a little statement here in Walker, Turley, and Leonard's book, Massacre at Mountain Meadows, 2008. After the massacre, the story of an attack solely by Indians would be told as a cover-up again and again, long after it had any kind of credibility. Well, these guys still still pushing a cover-up. And the main thing I have found and noticed is that they're saying the Indians did all the dirty work against the women and children. So you guys are still doing cover-ups. All right, Casey W. Olson has a comment about their book, Turley et al.'s book, Massacre at Mountain Meadows. In discussing the undue blame that Mormons initially placed on the Paiute Indians for the massacre, the book failed to recognize that Mormon leaders knowingly continued to allow this inaccuracy to be perpetuated. All right, so what did the church do to Juanita Brooks? Well, Arrington talks about this in his diaries as well, 1975 to 1980. Ward Magleby said that on the program, some kind of program on Dimension 5 TV, that Juanita Brooks and Carl, I think that's her husband, had mentioned that for a period after the book on Mountain Meadows Massacre, for a period after the book appeared, she was told by her bishop not to participate actively in the church. I suppose that meant she was told not to bear her testimony and that she was released from any calling or activity. So kind of this informal disfellowship. After Brooks's book came out on Mountain Meadows, she was told not to participate actively in church. Arrington interpreted that she shouldn't bear her testimony, and that she was released from any calling. Grant H. Palmer talks about this in his book, Restoring Christ. Brooks was unofficially disfellowshipped for publishing her book on Mountain Meadows. She was asked not to comment at church, not to make comments at church, and even her husband was punished by never being asked to pray again in church. So that's how the church treated them. All right, so Juanita Brooks actually did an interview in Dialogue, spring of 1974, cover is pictured above, where she talked about this herself. She says, after her book came out on the Mountain Meadows, her husband was never asked to do anything in church. He was never asked to offer a prayer, never answered a question in class, and of course, Brooks, had not been either. So it was the same thing for Brooks. She was never asked to pray anymore, didn't answer questions in class. And if anybody should be bringing up information and history, it's Juanita, the expert. But she just had to sit there, it sounds like, in silence, church. And it's interesting to note that previously her husband was a member of 2 bishoprics and was superintendent of Sunday school. So after that, he was released, I guess, and, demoted. All right, so from the same interview here in Dialogue, Brooks had previously been a stake president of the Relief Society for 7 years and on the MIA board. So she had some fairly high callings. Stake president of the Relief Society for 7 years. But after the book appeared, they asked her, were you called to any other position? And she answered no. All right, so from the same interview, this book, and that was her book on Mountain Meadows Massacre in 1950, she said that book branded her, Brooks, as an apostate. So she's kind of informally disfellowshipped, but the church really wanted to just keep it quiet, to keep it silent. But her book got out, and a lot of people read it. Okay, the same interview here. I, Brooks, was never taught Mountain Meadows Massacre. I went through all of the Sunday school classes and all of the religion classes, and the massacre was never mentioned except as a horrible massacre in which the Indians participated. So that's interesting, her experience growing up. I really recommend this site, Stuff You Missed in Sunday School. Yeah, and for a lot of Mormons growing up, they missed Mountain Meadows Massacre. Okay, Brooks continues in the same interview. They didn't even mention John D. Lee. They just skimmed over the massacre itself, and we've seen that from a lot of books that we've looked at. We could go through our teachings, but never anything about the massacre. All right, speech here by the Apostle M. Russell Ballard, BYU speech 2009. Ballard is pictured above. When a movie about the Mountain Meadows Massacre came out, it was most likely September Dawn 2007, because he said it was like 2 years ago or a year and a half ago or whatever. He didn't mention the name. He doesn't want any Mormons to go watch this. No BYU students should go and watch this. So he doesn't mention the name, but I'm pretty sure it's September Dawn. But Ballard said the promoters did everything they could to provoke the church into making it, the movie, a major topic of conversation. But we completely ignored it. We refused to allow them to set the agenda. So, wow, Ballard coming up with this ingenious idea to completely ignore Mountain Meadows Massacre. Well, that's what you've been doing. That's what you've been doing for 100 years, Ballard. This is not a genius idea. And actually, they had to get away from this idea. They had to put out their own book. Okay, an article by Chris Lee, Fanatics and a Forgotten Massacre, LA Times, 2007. Talks about Tom Kimball. He's an editor for the Mormon History Association. And he's talking about the film September Dawn. He says that it has been put on a do not watch list by the LDS Church officials. September Dawn, do not watch list. He says that the movie is blacklisted already. So, and one way we know that is because Ballard won't mention it. And they won't talk about it either. It's blacklisted, and the movie implicates Brigham Young as being responsible for ordering the massacre, and that's really where the goalpost is now for Mormon apologists. They really want to protect Brigham Young. All right, going back to Kay Birmingham and her book, An American Fraud, 2011, she talks about what it was like growing up in the Mormon Church. She says, looking back, I would realize that when I studied the social sciences and, as required, the Book of Mormon and Mormon history, I had never been taught the real story on these subjects. Entirely omitted was any accurate history of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So that's interesting. And yeah, growing up and not getting the true history. Of course, Kay is pictured above. She's got some videos on YouTube. I don't really remember hearing anything about it when I was growing up in the church, like in the ward house, being a chapel Mormon. I did have one BYU professor that mentioned it, and all I remember him saying is he said that was not the church's finest moment. All right, so from the same source here, Kay Birmingham. As a student in Utah public schools in the 60s and 70s, I never learned of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Yeah, because we just went through those books, some of the ones that she probably had in the 1960s and 1970s, and they don't mention it, or they blame the Indians, or they try to cover it up. So she's right here. She said, I never learned of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, the Utah War, which wasn't really a war, nobody died, and the various federal laws criminalizing polygamy. Never learned of that either in these Utah public school textbooks because they were written by Mormons. These were never mentioned or were at most footnotes in my textbooks. All right, Kay makes another statement here. When justice for the dead of the Mountain Meadows Massacre was attempted, the prophet Brigham Young contradicted himself in affidavits and revised discovery responses. So Kay is a good source for that because she is an attorney. All right, so in this book, An American Fraud, she tells a story here. She says in 1999, remains of 29 of the slaughtered of Mountain Meadows were discovered during the ground preparation for the erection of an LDS church memorial on the site. They were actually using a backhoe trying to build this new memorial, and oops, like on the second or third bucket, a whole bunch of bones from the victims of Mountain Meadows Massacre came up. I guess it was 29 victims. All right, so Kay continues. Utah state law in existence at the time required reporting of human remains found on private property and a scientific analysis made to determine the cause of death. That was the law. You had to report the human remains and do a scientific analysis. All right, Birmingham continues. However, in part due to an email sent September 6 from the then Mormon Utah Governor Mike Leavitt, and then an immediate change to the law requiring death analysis. That's interesting, an immediate change in the law. The bones of these dead were hurriedly reburied in a mass grave vault without the permission or approval of the descendants. And those bones initially went to BYU. So this whole process was controlled by the church. The church really didn't want an in-depth scientific investigation of these bones. They did do brief evaluations of them, and many of the bones or the skulls had bullet holes in the backs of their heads. But this was a complete public relations nightmare for the church, and they called on Mormon Utah Governor Mike Leavitt to help out, and Leavitt actually has ancestors that were involved in Mountain Meadows, like Dudley Leavitt. Of course, Mike Leavitt is pictured above here. All right, so let's go to John G. Turner, Brigham Young Pioneer Prophet Book, 2012. So that's where we are now, 2012 in the chronology. Local leaders instructed the perpetrators to keep silent about their deeds and then undertook a remarkably ineffective cover-up. So it depends on who you talk to. Bagley says that the cover-up was fairly effective. Things did leak out. Turner is saying that it was an ineffective cover-up. All right, Turner does mention Bagley. He says in 2002, the historian Will Bagley documented a long history of denial, obfuscation, and obstruction on the part of the church leaders in relation to the massacre. Bagley is pictured above. All right, same source here. By 1861, Brigham Young knew that Mormons bore responsibility for the crime at Mountain Meadows and wanted to make sure that their fellow church members shielded them from prosecution. Okay, Turner continues. By the early 1870s, 15 years had passed since the butchery at Mountain Meadows, and none of those involved had even stood trial. So if you can't blame Brigham Young for the massacre, you can certainly blame him for not putting anybody on trial for 15 years. All right, a statement here from Jim Whitefield. This is from his book, The Mormon Delusion, Volume 3, Discarded Doctrines and Nonsense Revelations, 2012. Whitefield is pictured above. I remember asking about the Mountain Meadows Massacre and being told that it was an Indian massacre of a wagon train in Utah, which was wrongly blamed on the Mormon Church and to not worry about it. So that was his experience. I believe he's a convert. His experience in the church. He continues here. Participants in the massacre were sworn to complete secrecy and were not to even tell their own wives about the massacre. Well, yeah, some of that got out, but. All right, so let's go to the Mormon essay, Peace and Violence Among the 19th Century Latter-day Saints, May 2014, when it first came out. This is on the church's website, churchofjesuschrist.org. Talk a little bit about the cover-up of Mountain Meadows. The Mormon perpetrators sought to cover up the crime by placing the entire blame on local Paiutes, some of whom were also members of the church. That's kind of interesting. Some of the Paiutes were Mormons as well. Notice how they don't mention Brigham Young being one of the ones who covered it up, but he certainly did. All right, let's go to Gregory A. Prince's book, Leonard Arrington and the Writing of Mormon History, 2016. Prince is pictured above. The Indians were still being officially blamed for the massacre more than a century later. That's 100 years. Even though historians knew that the actual situation was much more complex and fraught. All right, so in this book by Prince, there's a statement by Spencer W. Kimball, who said, "We try to be very careful about the way that we bring these matters up." Well, what were the matters that he tries to be very careful about the way they bring them up? Well, it's the Danites, Mountain Meadows Massacre, and the Negro question. Interesting. We try to be very careful about these things. All right. Also from the same book, he says, during Arrington's tenure, the Mountain Meadows Massacre was a subject largely off limits. And we know that from the books that Arrington wrote. Great Basin Kingdom never mentions Mountain Meadows. Doesn't do a good job at all covering it in American Moses and other writings. And that, according to Prince, was because Mountain Meadows Massacre was a subject largely off limits. All right, a quick little statement in the new book entitled Saints, No Unhallowed Hand, 1846 to 1893, came out in 2020, put out a history put out by the church. At this time in 2020, they put out 2 volumes so far. This was in chapter 18. It says, later, after the dead were buried, Bishop Philip Klingensmith and stake president Isaac Haight told the militiamen to keep their role in the massacre a secret. So, a little bit honest there by the church in this church-published work. Klingensmith and Haight told the militiamen to keep their role in the massacre a secret. All right, back to Bagley here. In 1988, a group of committed outsiders, both Mormon and non-Mormon, finally compelled local citizens and the state of Utah to bring an end to more than 130 years of the unconscionable neglect of a vast mass grave and a major national historic site. It's been neglected as far as monuments, etc. All right, a statement by J.K. Fancher in the Harrison Daily Times, 1991. They came up with the idea for a new monument to correct some errors and to make a new statement on the massacre. All right, a letter from Ronald Loving to Bagley in 1995. Ronald Loving was a member of the Mountain Meadows Association who were trying to build an appropriate monument. Loving wrote, I have an agreement with President Hinckley to try and stop any book writing, TV, and movies about Mountain Meadows Massacre from being presented to the general public. So that's kind of crazy, man. Loving has an agreement with the prophet of the church, President Hinckley, to try and stop any book writing, any TV, and any movies being made about Mountain Meadows. So cover-up is still alive and well here in 1995. Okay, finally in 1990, they dedicated a handsome granite memorial listing the names of the victims and the survivors at a cost of $300,000. And by they, that is the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's pretty cheap compared to paying reparations. Reparations could be hundreds of millions or more for these poor families. And it's interesting to note that the church basically controls all of these monuments. They control what is said on these monuments. They own the land. And this is kind of unusual. This should be a national heritage site, but it's not. It's owned by the church. All right, some more information in Bagley's book here. The text on the monument was careful not to assign blame. Oh, how convenient. It states simply that the Fancher party was attacked while en route to California. Doesn't say who did it. Doesn't talk about the Indians, doesn't talk about white settlers, doesn't talk about Mormon settlers, doesn't talk about the Mormon church, stake presidents and bishops that were involved, nothing. So when this monument went up, the church was still in cover-up mode. And the explanatory markers, kind of as pictured above here, at the memorial were equally vague about what happened in the valley. So, yeah, vague markers, vague explanatory plaques. Church still in cover-up mode in 1990 here. All right, so a member of the first presidency, Gordon B. Hinckley, I guess he wasn't prophet yet, spoke at the 1990 dedication. Of course, he's pictured above. Looks like he has a cane there. That's kind of interesting. You could whack you in the head with his cane. He said that no matter how much one might study the Mountain Meadows, the event defied understanding. That's another common cop-out that the church uses. We just can't understand it. We don't know what happened. We just have to speculate. And sure, that's partially true, but we know enough. How about standing up and taking responsibility? No. They're just going to say, we just can't understand what happened. It defies all understanding. And Hinckley admitted that he had not come to apologize. Some non-Utahns in the audience were dismayed. The descendants, in Arkansas came to this event. They couldn't believe that the church would not apologize. It's so strange. It's like things that you learn in kindergarten. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. I apologize. You never hear the church saying these kind of things. Same thing with blacks in the priesthood. They've never apologized to the blacks. All right, Bagley continues here. The evasive wording on the 1990 markers had drawn the ridicule of outsiders, including New York Times reporter Timothy Egan, who called the plaques the most cryptic historical markers in the West. Plaques put up at Mountain Meadows were the most cryptic historical markers in the West. Timothy Egan, New York Times, and pictured above are some cryptic symbols. The Mormon Church just didn't want people to know what happened. The markers did nothing to answer questions about what happened. Ridiculous. What are these plaques and markers for? And then Baines talks about this in his book. He talks about BYU President Rex E. Lee, who also spoke at the 1990 dedication. He's pictured above. Rex E. Lee said, our task for today is not to look backward. Let's not even look backward. Let's not even look at the history here. When this whole site is all about history, it's all about history. Our task today is not to look backward, nor to rationalize, nor to engage in any kind of retroactive analysis. Oh God, we're not going to engage in any kind of retroactive analysis, nor an apology. Again, they say it. They directly say it. We're not going to apologize. We're not going to analyze what happened. We're not going to put true history on the markers and the plaques. All right, so 9 years later, 1999, the LDS Church built and agreed to maintain a second monument at Mountain Meadows. All right, so Gordon B. Hinckley also spoke at this dedication in 1999. By this time, I guess he was the prophet and president of the church. Hinckley pictured above. Hinckley said in his talk, "Let the book of the past be closed. Let's not think about it. Don't open that book. Don't read about Mountain Meadows in a book. Close that book." And he also said, this is not a time for recrimination or accusations. Why not? We know the history, buddy. You guys are the ones to blame. It is a time of recrimination and accusations, and it always will be until you come fully clean. Fully clean and put out a fully truthful book, which you have not done. And then he also says, this is not a time for the assignment of blame. Yeah, because you guys are responsible. Man. All right, so also in Hinckley's speech at this 1999 occasion, he is the prophet now. He wasn't at the last dedication. Hinckley also said, no one can explain what happened in these meadows 142 years ago. We may speculate, but we do not know. We do not understand it. Well, then the church put out a book, Massacre at Mountain Meadows, basically explaining what happened according to the church. Of course, not doing a fully truthful job, but pretty good book for the church. I guess they went against the prophet's admonition here, and tried to explain it later. But at this event, he didn't want anybody to be able to explain what happened. We may speculate, but we do not know. We do not understand it. It's very convenient to say you don't understand something when you're responsible for something. And part of this speech showed up in the Ensign magazine, November 1999. All right, so we're going to continue here with Hinckley's speech at this 1999 dedication. It looks like here that Hinckley has had his lawyers, the church lawyers, draft up some language here in his talk, because the church doesn't want to have to pay any reparations to the victims. It's probably what they should do. Those kind of lawsuits have opened up, like I said, hundreds of millions of dollars. So listen to this legalistic language. It's really something here that they put this into a speech at a monument dedication for Mountain Meadows, speaking face to face to the descendants of the victims. So here we go. Hinckley continued, "We cannot comprehend it, Mountain Meadows. We can only say that the past is long since gone. That which we have done here must never be construed as an acknowledgement on the part of the church of any complicity in the occurrences of that fateful and tragic day. So that's legalese put in by their lawyers. That which we do here must never be construed as an acknowledgement on the part of the church of any complicity, of any complicity. They're basically saying and doing the opposite of what they should be doing. All right, Bagley continues. Many were surprised to hear the church leader make such an explicit and legalistic denial of any accountability. It's pretty shocking. And now in 2020 that we have learned that the church has $125 billion in an investment fund in Ensign Peak Advisors. Don't put the legalistic language in there. And if you get sued or you take responsibility, you can afford to pay these reparations. All right, LDS church attorneys apparently feared an apology would lead to wrongful death lawsuits, so none was given. Good, the church should be sued. Take accountability, take responsibility. Pay the wrongful death lawsuits. You can afford it. These are the things that you learn in kindergarten. Say you're sorry when you hurt somebody. The prophet of the church should read Robert Fulgram's All I Really Needed to Know. All I really needed to know I learned in kindergarten. All right, Bagley continues here. In trying to protect himself and the men directly responsible for a brutal crime, Brigham Young spun a web of lies that still entangles his church and its leaders. And we see that still entangling the church and its leaders from these statements that Hinckley has made at these dedications. Manipulation of the historical record will forever obscure many of the details of what really happened during this long ago September in 1857. Yet the destruction of key documents and the manufacturing of evidence to manipulate history stand as an indictment rather than a vindication of the guilty. What are you trying to hide? What did you do that you need to destroy documents? What did you do that you need to manufacture evidence? Only the truth will lay to rest the ghosts of Mountain Meadows. And the church is still not there yet. They've gotten a lot better. Still not there yet, as I've stated on other slides. The truth matters. And on that note, that's going to do it. Don't really have much more to say here. This mass murder, this mass grave, church still not taking full responsibility for this. But that's going to do it for this video. And I thank you for watching the Mountain Meadows Massacre cover-up video.